was enough, because it didn't change much and he was happy with the current state of affairs. The reward for killing the Chimera Ogre was reported to be 27 million eras, and along with it a plaque with an extra S-rank mercenary. The rewards glittered with a golden sheen. It was depicted that there was money for the head, and it was said that the Chimera Ogre's corpse was handed over to the Mercenary Guild for further study, and that it was worth more than 20 million. Harvey handed over the coins, saying that he should take his share, because all the work was done by him. Chuck thanked him. In total it was 47 million eras. The protagonist passes by the shelves with vegetables. He brought the coin closer to examine it, and thought that 47 million was an incredible number. The tired guy looked at 120,000er. He remembered that in his past life he risked his life fulfilling orders and received at best a millionaire. Chuck put the coin in his bag and thought about what to do with this money. He looked sharply at his spear, thinking. A view of the wooden doors in the darkness, behind which a conversation was taking place. Bob crossed his arms and asked the man in armor what he was like. He answered that he was pretty good. The guy raised his hand to his temple and said that it was better to let him see for himself. Varen put a hook stick to his head. The man closed his eyes, saw everything that was happening there. Varen opened his eyes and thought that Chuck was definitely above S rank. Harvey, taking his head away from the stick, asked to simply assign him an SS rank. The man with the mustache put his hand on his belt and thought that he couldn't decide this alone. He said that he would think about it, and noted that this guy, classless, who became the supreme master of martial arts in just 4 years, he would like Xian. Chuck stood in the hallway and looked into the darkness. On the floor, a black liquid was moving. He called out to Neville. Suddenly, the guy crawled out of the liquid. He stood, pressing his hand to his stomach, and said that he was glad to meet him and asked how he could help. Chuck remembered looking at his spear. The spear was hovering in a pink cloud, and the hero replied that he was not very interested in weapons, and before the main thing was that it could be waved and stabbed. An ogre appeared before his eyes, and he explained that during the battle with the ogre, he felt something and asked a question about whether his skin would be easier to pierce with another weapon. Chuck imagined himself fighting with this spear and added that he would not want it to become a burden in an emergency. The hero looked at him with anticipation and thought that this is why he now wants to buy something better. He said that he needs a weapon. Neville raised his finger and asked if he prefers to buy it or create it, and what is his budget. Chuck listened to him and thought that even if the creation takes longer, he would prefer it. He answered that 47 million eras and he would like to create it. Neville answered that this is not such a large amount of money. The guy was surprised and asked again, about 47 million eras. The bearded man holds a shiny sword in his hand. The young man explains that Airbreeze only cooperates with first-class blacksmiths, and that the price of their services is appropriate. Neville touched the eyepiece and said that if he leaves his soul as collateral, he can take a loan for a large amount and at a low interest rate. Chuck, not understanding, refused. The guy looked him in the eyes and asked if there were any ways to create a weapon for this money. Neville pressed the pink projection and replied that if that was the deal he could introduce him to someone. Asking if he minded meeting now, Chuck agreed. The man raised his hand up and said okay. Chuck watched closely as Neville ran his finger down, leaving a black trail. Suddenly a purple portal opened between them. Neville sank back into the liquid and said that they could communicate through this. Chuck raised his finger, pointing at the portal, and wondered what the hell it was, if it was a rift in space. He wondered what the middleman had such methods, wondering what Airbreeze was all about. Chuck stared into the portal. A voice from there asked that he was just a kid. On the other side of the portal a girl with a hammer on her shoulder looked at him. She said that her name was Jessie, and she didn't know how many more times they would meet and that they needed to at least exchange names. She looked at him questioningly and asked why he didn't come in. Chuck thought about the dark elf in surprise and replied that yes, he would come in now. He stepped into the portal, saying his name and said that he would like to order a spear. Jessie asked what shape he preferred. The guy pulled out the spear, showed it, said that let it look like this. The girl abruptly joined him and said that it was a spear of the Central Plains. She looked up at the hero and asked if he could show his spear style. The guy, as if he had not heard, asked again. He looked down and asked why she needed it, thinking that it was taboo for a martial arts master to show his style. Jessie was calm and replied that she needed it to make a spear together with his technique. Chuck looked at her angrily. She added that the details vary greatly from person to person, and this is important to take into account. The hero asked that she want to create a spear for his martial arts style. The girl lowered her head and called him a boy. She hit herself in the chest furiously and screamed that she was 400 years old, that she loved to hit with a hammer and had been working as a blacksmith for 350 years. And although her starting conditions were different from those of the gnomes who were talented in blacksmithing from birth. Chuck listened attentively, without taking his eyes off her. Jessie said with a serious face that for 350 years she, as a blacksmith, had put in real effort and her abilities were in no way inferior to those of the gnomes. Chuck was in a daze and saw Chloe in front of him. She was saying that they had different starting conditions from the very beginning. The guy smiled and thought that they were similar. View of the brick wall of the house. It was audible that Jessie was talking about why she was telling such a thing to a child she was seeing for the first time. She turned away and said upset that if you don't like it, go to the gnomes. Chuck replied that he would show you. Jessie turned around and asked again in surprise. Chuck added that he would show you his martial arts. The girl looked at the hero with confusion and said that he was surprisingly easy to persuade and that usually, suspecting that something was fishy, martial artists leave after something like that. The guy looked at her deeply and noted that she said that her efforts over 350 years were real. Chuck and Jessie looked at each other in silence. The girl laughed, saying that he was too trusting. The hero put his spear on his shoulder and replied that it was the first time he heard that. He was usually told that he was suspicious of everyone around him. Jessie smiled contentedly, putting her hands in her pocket. She left, noticing that he knew how to choose his words. The corners of the girl's lips involuntarily rose, but she lowered them. Chuck thoughtfully watched her as she began to speak. Jessie threw her hammer over her shoulder and said that she liked him and that she was calculating, but she would make him a weapon with a price tag higher than he offered money. The girl smiled. She added that he would make a great regular customer. Jessie watched him carefully. He was thinking about how it would take several months to make the spear and that he should relax. Chuck sat down to meditate, flaring up with pink magic. He closed his eyes and thought, remembering that fight with the Chimera Ogre, which was the first real one since he became a top-level martial artist. He thought that he had learned a lot, and this knowledge needed to be fully absorbed. Chuck remembered a dialogue with Chloe, where she said that he understood the situation well and this was already a kind of talent. The guy continued to reason that understanding the situation, what Chloe called talent, and these rudiments grew into a skill during training on the mountain. They talk about the sixth sense that is felt beyond the five senses. The green monster looked down at Chuck and the guy thought that he felt it in the battle against the ogre, where his business moves itself, even before he realizes the need for it. Perhaps this is the sixth sense. Chuck sat on the floor, glowing with pink magic and thought that it was a powerful force. But he could not rely on it alone and training on the mountain sharpened his sense of touch and sixth sense. But his other senses were not affected. A graph of all the hero's senses was depicted and he continued that there was an imbalance, and that something had to be done about it later. Chuck opened his eyes, frowning, suggesting that if this was not done, then he would feel it later. It would be more difficult for him to solve it. A two-story building at sunset, which was said to be a mercenary guild. Bob stood behind the bar and asked about the plans for today and whether he was going to request the next task. Chuck looked closely and answered that no, then asked about what turned him into an ogre chimera. The man poured a drink into a glass and asked a question about what was bothering him so much. Having answered himself that he thought it was quite possible, he continued that a chimera always has a creator. Chuck listened to him intently. Bob claimed that it would be difficult to investigate this alone, so he cooperates with the Guild of Magicians. The ogre fought with people with a smile, and the guy reasoned that he had never stumbled upon an ogre chimera in his past life, and no one completed this task, or the creature dealt with the mercenaries. The creature in a dark suit, with a glowing eye, watched. Chuck admitted that it looked like the owner of the dungeon. In 6 months it would be revealed that he was the creator of the chimera and maybe in a past life it was him too. The hero looked, thinking that he killed the chimera and the future changed and decisively declared that he also wanted to see the body. It is about the Behanger Guild of Magicians. A monster with big fangs opened his mouth, and someone said that he was glad to meet him. Chuck looked excitedly from behind at the man who was using magic to twist his head and eye. Working with magic, the man introduced himself. It was the black magician John. The guy watched what was happening with disgust. The magician asked if he was surprised, saying that he was in the process of researching the chimera. Chuck also introduced himself and John asked about being Korean. The magician pointed his finger and continued that although he was also from Korea, it was unlikely that they were from the same dimension and asked if there was a gate crisis in his world. The hero looked puzzled and asked what kind of gate crisis it was. The magician replied that monsters came from the gates connected to another dimension, but it didn't matter anymore. John grabbed Chuck's hand and said that even though he was from another dimension, he was still glad to meet him and was very happy. He hadn't seen a Korean for a long time. The magician looked intently and switched over. He held the hero's hand and noted that although he didn't have to be happy about that. Chuck looked at him questioningly and asked what he meant. John laughed awkwardly and said nothing. The mage asked what brought him here. The guy looked at him sternly and said that he wanted to look at the body of the chimera. The fork in the path and talk about changing the flow of the future. He reasoned that he needed more information to quickly get the Devnark armor. John calmly offered to tell what he learned. The mage pointed to the ogre's head and said that since he was dead, he wouldn't be able to find out some things for sure, but one thing was for sure: he had a lot of high-level spells on him. Chuck looked at him calmly and listened to what the black mage who created this chimera was probably in the ranks of great mages. Opening the monster's mouth, the mage showed that his mouth was sewn up, because in order to check the chimera, it was necessary for him to go wild with hunger. Jake remembered moments from the past and wondered why he tore the deer apart but didn't eat it. John spread his arms out to the sides and laughed, saying that was it. If he had his way, he would continue talking about artificial monsters, but it seemed like he wasn't very interested. Chuck asked him what he wanted to say earlier. John looked him in the eye and listened, saying that it wasn't funny, only because of that, he was like. Although he doesn't have to be happy about that. Then he replied that it was nothing. The magician said that he had confused the cause and effect relationship, and the guy was surprised by what he heard and asked how he knew. John looked up and replied that he thought he had already guessed it. He was amazing. It is said that the black magician can read someone's soul. The magician was wearing slippers and came closer to the hero, saying that in his place. He, with furious eyes, added that he would have fallen into despair and gone crazy. John narrowed his eyes and asked if he understood. Chuck looked at him sternly and said that he would suffer forever after death. The magician confirmed. John smiled and asked if he could find out why he had such a complicated cause and effect relationship. The guy raised his hand and asked why he should answer and how he could trust him. The magician replied that he would tell him about something he didn't know. John put his hand to his heart and declared that he would give him a mana oath and never tell him about anything he heard. The black magician leaned back, falling backwards. Chuck looked forward and thought about how he had no idea what was happening to him now, but since he had given a mana oath, this was a great opportunity for him. The guy abruptly declared that he was a regressor. John looked at him in surprise and asked that he had returned to the past after death. Chuck stood and listened attentively. The magician said that he would look into what had confused his cause and effect relationship. This was life and death. He had broken so many fundamental rules that he would face commensurate karma. John looked closely into his eyes and said that if he knew why she was confused, then he could tell him something else. Chuck looked at him questioningly. He looked down, enchanted, listening that he was special. John smiled and continued that it was not only his cause and effect relationship that was twisted. Everything around him went dark and Chuck heard a slow, "You still," which was repeated over and over again. The hero covered his ears in horror. The magician's face was dark. He said that he could not. John said that he could not tell him. Chuck, holding his head, asked what it meant. The magician added that if he told, then the hero looked at him in horror. Blood poured from John's eyes and he said that then he would die. Chuck looked and thought, that's blood. The mage's hand was shaking and he said that he didn't think his life was his own anymore. The hero was shocked by what he heard. The mage wiped his eyes and said that he was sorry, wouldn't he come back next time, that he was confused and needed to collect his thoughts. Chuck was stunned and thought about what had happened and definitely before. Mercer raised her hand up and told him to stop right now, said that this was her abode. She stretched out her hand and told him to back off or she would destroy him. The hero put his hand on his belt and cursed and was called out. He turned to look. Scarlet was standing in front of him and waving her hand. She asked if he was that crazy kid from Mount Mercer and added that they hadn't seen each other for so long and he had grown a lot. Chuck looked questioningly, asking who it was. The girl got angry and screamed that he didn't remember her. He was so heartless. She was Scarlet, the one who taught him magic. The guy couldn't figure it out in his head. He silently looked at the chandelier. They looked at each other, and he asked her not to lie. Scarlet hit him hard in the face. Chuck, with a battered face, said that he had not seen Scarlet for a long time. The girl stood in front of him and asked what brought him to the Magician's Guild, noting that she was still glad to meet, to which she received the answer that he had some business. Scarlet looked back and asked again about business. The protagonist turned around when Scarlet loudly asked if he was there because of the crazy fool Mike. The girl imagined Mike holding skulls in his hands and said that black magicians are by nature very pleasant, but this one is especially creepy. If Chuck has not completely lost his mind, then messing with him is more expensive for himself. Scarlet touched her finger to the protagonist's face and said that she is sure that the protagonist can take care of himself, but he needs to be careful. A slight smile appeared on her face and she remarked that it was nice to see a familiar face after so many years. Leaving him, the girl said that she was busy today, so she would leave first. He could drop in on her if he missed her. Her lab was on the 3rd floor. She would treat him to tea, at least if he came. Chuck waved his hand after her. The protagonist's hand stopped. The protagonist introduced Mercer and Mike, and noted that what she was saying to herself, a sentence unfinished by Mike. He watched Scarlet, and thought that he had a faint feeling that people had become more favorable to him. Everything was very strange. Lowering his head, Chuck came to the conclusion that something was happening, but he did not know what exactly. Holding the spear on his shoulder, the protagonist thought that such things were too complicated. He was unnecessarily distracted by them. He decided to switch to what was happening around him. The protagonist looked at the double two-headed troll and thought that the reward for him was 60 million. Harvey waved his hand and said that they met again. He said with a satisfied look that this time he would show him what he was capable of. Smiling, Chuck replied that he was waiting for this. The protagonist fought with trolls and thought that he was acquiring new connections, and only in his second life did he understand that a person needs a person. He stopped pushing other people away. Looking at Harvey, the protagonist reasoned that he turned out to be a good friend, Over the years of practice his feelings had dulled, but from being near him he felt comfort. They had been traveling together for 3 months already. The man put the bag on the table and said that they had coped with this task with flying colors. 50 million belonged to Chuck. The protagonist thanked him with a satisfied look. He said with a serious look that this was not all. The protagonist was puzzled by the words that someone wanted to see him. The man introduced a muscular guy and said that Chuck wanted to see the captain of the mercenary squad, Torch Xian. The guys were taken aback by what they heard. The protagonist with a slight smile on his face said that he had heard of such a person. The main character presented a coat of arms, which depicted a fiery fist, and noted that the captain of the Torch, a huge squad, which consists of more than 100 mercenaries, is one of 3 SS-rank mercenaries in Behanger. Chuck imagined himself watching Xian and noted that he was a master of the highest level of martial arts, who had passed 100 steps of Shaolin. He admired him in his past life. Smiling, Chuck emphasized the fact that among the many heroes, he chose him as his idol, because he also had no class. Xian smoked a cigar and said his name. Grinning, he noted that the main character was also out of class, as they say, and he must have had a hard time. Xian looked at Chuck's face and thought that as a top-level master, he now understood that he was strong. He put out his cigar with his finger and emphasized that this man would soon become a supreme martial artist. Looking up, Xian clarified whether the protagonist was 18, noting that the world was cruel to those who were out of class. He felt it on his own skin. Chuck laughed while listening to the words that he was so young and had already reached the highest level of martial arts. It was amazing. Sitting opposite, Xian suggested to stop empty chatter and get down to business, after which he called him to the Torch. Frowning, the man said that the protagonist's work was impressive. He defeated the Ogre Chimera and would soon reach SS rank. He guaranteed the position of vice captain if he worked for him. Looking at Chuck, Xian said that this was an unexpected offer, and he was probably confused, but he would help him. Placing the box on the table, the man asked the protagonist to decide when he looked at it. The protagonist was surprised. Opening the box, Xian told him that it was a weak energy pill. The man smirked and emphasized the fact that he would give it to him, under one condition. Placing the document on the table, Xian asked him to sign this contract. Holding the paper in front of him, Chuck asked if he should obey Xian's orders. Holding out his hand, the man said that this was not a magical contract, but if he broke it, he would be held accountable in some way. This was necessary to restrain him. Frowning, Chuck listened as he was told that if he told about his martial arts, he would be given a stronger energy pill. Taking the document away from himself, the protagonist asked if anyone would agree to such a thing. Xian, looking mad, replied that people would agree to such a thing if they wanted to become mercenaries in Behanger. Stunned, Harvey asked what the protagonist had done. Standing in front of the bar, Chuck replied that he would not sign a slave contract. Holding his head, Harvey came to the conclusion that since things had turned out this way, it would be better to leave Behanger, and the protagonist asked if things were that bad. The man imagined Xian keeping people on chains and said that now Chuck, judging by the situation, was in mortal danger. Xian was involved in a lot of suspicious business. All the mercenaries of A rank and above were in his squad and under his control. He would cause problems if he resisted. The protagonist's face was dissatisfied. Harvey remembered kneeling and crying and said that in the past, when Xian was S rank and he was A rank, he also rejected his offer. Then the flow of work stopped. Everything was taken under the control of the Torch. The guy greedily drank beer and said that he received S rank in another city, returned there, but he had already become an SS rank mercenary. Chuck's face was thoughtful. Holding his chin, the protagonist wondered what to feel when he saw the ugly side of his idol. Joyful Harvey clarified whether the protagonist wanted to go to Manga Core with him, and someone asked them if they heard the news. The man turned around and said that they had found the dungeon of a black magician. Turning around, Chuck listened to the fact that perhaps this was the same magician who created the Ogre Chimera. They seemed to want to gather a group for cleansing, led by the Torch squad. The protagonist frowned at these words. Standing in a dark room, the girl said that it took longer. Standing behind, Chuck replied that it was okay, he didn't need the weapon that urgently, to which he received the answer that he continued to give her money while working, so it took longer. The protagonist took the spear in his hand. While he was examining it, the girl said that mithril was the base, and the coating was made of black iron. They conduct mana and chi well, so it would be easier to use the sword of chi. The protagonist was surprised. The guy calmly noticed that Chuck had caught Jesse's eye. The protagonist paid attention to him and clarified what he meant, to which he received the answer that the spear was made of very expensive materials. The guy imagined Chuck bringing her bags of money and told her that he gave her money while working to somehow improve it. Most of it went to materials. She worked practically for free. The guy walked next to him and said that he did not understand her actions. Looking at the protagonist, he emphasized that he had a strange charm. Because of it, he wanted to help people. Chuck was taken aback by what he heard. Bowing, the guy said that he had talked too much and it was time for him to go. The protagonist could contact him at any time convenient for him. The protagonist stood silently. The dumbfounded protagonist reasoned that it was not his strange words that surprised him, but the fact that they confirmed his suspicions. Chuck remembered how, at a younger age, he smiled and noted that he felt something was wrong for the first time on Mount Mercer. Writing it off to luck, he continued on his way as if nothing had happened. Walking through the forest, the protagonist wondered that if there was something inside him that attracted people, then everyone he met. Chuck imagined his comrades. The picture with his comrades collapsed. Shrouded in a dark aura, the protagonist wondered if this could be considered something real. Harvey came to him and asked where he had been. He was standing in front of him. Looking at his comrade's face, Chuck reasoned that if his suspicions were true, then even his friendship with Harvey. The guy hugged the protagonist and asked why he was so gloomy and whether he was worried about the raid in the dungeon. The protagonist thought about the raid in the dungeon with an empty look. He imagined the head of the monster and thought that since the future had changed, his worries were only confirmed. Since he had killed the ogre chimera, the guild began to search for the black mage. The man pointed his finger at the cave, while Chuck thought that the dungeon was discovered 3 months earlier than in his past life. Xian approached him and asked if he was there again. He had a smirk on his face. Looking at the protagonist, he stated that since a recently risen star had joined the raid, it would be successful. The man was warming up his hands, while the protagonist thought that in his past life they could not join, because of another task, but this time they are participating, because the raid was transferred. Xian looked at the angry Harvey and noted that they had not seen each other for a long time. Xian grabbed his head and asked them to be careful. Looking at the angry Chuck, he stated that the dungeon is a very dangerous place. You cannot immediately predict your place and time of death. The mercenaries moved on. Harvey turned around and asked if Xian had just threatened to kill them in the chaos of the expedition. Looking at his skills, the protagonist said that he had thought long and hard about joining, but his stupid, useless abilities had decided for him. He had returned from Mount Mercer 3 months ago and had made no progress since then, and to break through the plateau, he needed the magical armor Denvark, which turned a third-rate warrior into a top martial artist. Chuck imagined a white light emitting from the man's blade. Harvey stood in front of him and said that Xian would not act rashly in front of the people, so there was no need to worry about it. The protagonist presented a table of human strength and noted that there would be only 27 people participating, 1 SS rank, for S rank, 12 A rank from the torch. Looking at the man with the staff, the protagonist added that even the guild master Baron had joined. Chuck hoped that he really wouldn't do anything. Holding his sword in front of him, Harvey said that there was no need to worry. He would chop off the head of anyone who did anything with his technique. He showed off his muscles, and the protagonist thought that Harvey had no reason to participate in this raid. He was there because he was worried about him. Looking at his comrade, the protagonist emphasized that he was grateful for this, because his relationship with Xian would deteriorate because of this. He suddenly opened his eyes wide. Standing next to Harvey, Chuck asked himself to stop thinking in his mind. The man raised his hand and cried out that the Behanger Mercenary Guild was heading to the Dark Mage's dungeon. Looking at the warriors, he noted that they did not know what to expect inside, but they were the best in Behanger. He frowned and said that they should be on guard and then defeat everything that comes their way. It was time to get to work. They ran towards the dungeon. The mercenaries entered a dark cave. The man held a torch in front of him while Chuck told us that the mercenary in front of them, Barry, was an A rank. Thanks to his mastery of external martial arts, his body was as hard as a rock, but it was torn in half like soft tofu. Barry's body was cut. He suddenly threw his head back while the protagonist said that the comrades who were following him stopped. Barry's eyes were wild. The guy watched him with a dumbfounded look. He noticed that Barry's feet were lying on the ground. The man was taken aback by what happened. After shining a light into the cave, they saw many monsters that surrounded them. The frightened guys cried out that they were chimeras. Looking around, Xian noticed that from the very beginning, it seemed that everything was not going smoothly. A huge monster appeared in front of him. Its body was suddenly cut apart. Xian, with a smirk on his face, called them insects. Chuck watched it from behind. While the monster was running towards the protagonist, he thought that Xian was strong. He would not stand a chance in a fight with him. The protagonist killed the monster with a powerful lunge. Holding the spear in front of him, Chuck thought that there were chimeras there. In his past life, this dungeon was empty. Dodging the attack, the protagonist wondered if it meant that the owner of the dungeon was there. Taken aback, the protagonist came to the conclusion that something was wrong there. He looked at the corpses of monsters and people. Xian stepped on the monster and said that they had too many losses, after which he asked if it was possible to continue the raid like this. The angry man stated that Xian's squad had barely suffered, to which he responded that it was not their fault that they were strong. Trying to catch his breath, Harvey said that Xian had only been protecting his squad, but it was amazing that he had managed to do so in such chaos. The protagonist imagined crossing off the warriors on the list and noted that in an hour in the dungeon, the team had lost 11 A-rank mercenaries. The dumbfounded girl sat on the ground and trembled in fear while the plot told us that only one of the surviving A-rank hunters was not part of the torch, after which we were introduced to an independent A-rank hunter, Mary. Harvey approached her and stated that thanks to him, she no longer had to worry. The guy was upset when Mary became scared of him and pressed herself against the wall, and asked if the protagonist knew that the arousal misattribution theory was complete nonsense. The man turned his gaze to Mary, who was calling him. She said with a sad expression that there had been huge losses. His face was serious. Sighing, the man apologized and said that was why they couldn't stay there, then clarified, otherwise how would they be able to face their dead comrades? Standing in front of her, he added that since the core of S and SS ranks were still alive, they could continue the raid. The sad man asked Mary to go back if she was not sure of success. Looking at the huge number of corpses, he said that no one would protect her on the way back. Stunned, Mary turned around. Looking at the walls, the girl said that she would go with them. The group began to move on. The man examined the cave and said that it was quiet. The mercenaries with a satisfied face began to discuss whether those monsters were stalling for time, and whether the dungeon master had escaped when they attacked his trail. Turning around, the man asked not to let down their guard because of all sorts of speculation. The guy calmly asked to wait, because there was something there. They looked at the doors. Holding the staff in front of him, Bob noted that there were no traps, it was just a door. Entering the room, dumbfounded Chuck thought this was the place. He remembered the man putting his fist on his chest and screaming that his life had changed for the better when he got this armor. He said with a satisfied look that after going through the cave, he saw a door. Chuck in his past life listened with an exhausted look that there was a huge library behind the door. The confused protagonist wondered what books he was touching. The protagonist began to sort through the bookshelf. He felt that there was a descent down behind the shelf. Smiling, Chuck came to the conclusion that the magical armor of Devnark was below. Xian watched him go and asked if this was a secret passage. He began to follow the protagonist, and noted that it was good work. Turning around, Chuck replied that he accidentally ran into him. The man smirked and said that the protagonist was very calm and that he liked them like that. The protagonist was suddenly taken aback. Xian dealt him a powerful blow. The man walked towards him and asked if the protagonist had dodged it, adding that he liked him even more now. Watching Chuck, Xian said that if he was not on his side, he would have to get rid of him. With such talent, he could not surpass him one day. Getting to his feet, the protagonist heard that Bob had gone with his subordinates to another room, so no one would interfere with him. Harvey stood behind him and asked who said that. Xian turned around and said that his subordinates were supposed to guard the entrance. Frowning, the guy cried out that he knew he would do it. He was always waiting for an opportunity, and finally showed his true nature. Stunned, Chuck asked how Harvey got there. The guy flew past him. Xian waved his hand and asked if the guys thought they could defeat him. Frowning, the protagonist thought that their chances were obviously low, especially if reinforcements from the torch arrived. The protagonist caught Harvey. He closed his eyes and cried out that they needed to go down. The protagonist presented the armor and noted that the magical armor of Devner increases the strength of the weak. If he gets it, he will have a chance to win. Chuck saw the armor. Harvey was standing behind him and preparing for a fight. His face was furious. Xian pierced his body through and through. The man's arm was sticking out of his body. The protagonist was taken aback by this. Xian pulled his fist out of Harvey's body. He pushed the guy away from himself. Smirking, he noted that this was not bad, considering that Harvey blocked his sword. Chuck was shocked by what happened. Happy moments with his comrades surfaced in his memories. Blood was flowing from the guy's nose. The protagonist was furious. He jumped back from the man's blow. Covering himself with his hand, Xian said that the protagonist, like him, lived in this world as a classless person. He knows the laws of this world, and strength decides everything. Dodging the swing of the spear, the man emphasized that no one could be trusted. Even the trash lying around would betray him sooner or later. Xian kicked him in the leg. They looked at each other while the man said that there was no point in this conversation and Chuck should just die. The beaten protagonist lay on the ground. Xian stood over him and said that he had a good weapon. He hit Chuck in the face and asked him to give him the spear. Inspecting the protagonist's weapon, the man said that it was much lighter than it looked. A drop of blood fell on the armor. Xian was suddenly taken aback. The armor began to transfer to the protagonist's body. The man suddenly jumped back. He wondered with a stunned look if the armor had transferred to Chuck and if it was magical. A red aura enveloped the protagonist's body. The enraged protagonist stood in front of him. Standing in a fighting stance, Xian mentally wondered what kind of dark energy it was. Chuck watched him silently. Blood was dripping from his mouth. They looked at each other in silence. A powerful explosion was heard behind the protagonist. Xian struck and asked what kind of dark energy it was and where it had gone, after which he asked to fight, because the protagonist had definitely become stronger after receiving the artifact. Chuck frowned and thought that this was true, but looking at his hand, the protagonist wondered what was going on. adding that he did not feel any changes in his internal energy and physical abilities at all. Enraged, Xian said that Chuck had dodged well, but it was time to end it. The protagonist was furious. He looked at the face of his dead comrade. The man rushed into battle. A ghost appeared between them, who said that this armor was a good item. They turned their gaze to the creature, which assumed that there would be a strong recoil. A barrier appeared in front of the man's fist, while the monster asked if the contract with Devnark had been concluded yet. Dumbfounded, Xian looked at the barrier. A dumbfounded Chuck thought that his own sixth sense was screaming at him that he shouldn't fight this. He looked at the ghost, who said that he would make an excellent offering. The guys were going down the stairs and shouting that they heard a noise. Bob, looking surprised, asked if this was the Dark Mage, the owner of this dungeon. The ghost stretched out his hand. Dumbfounded, Bob asked if this was a lich. The dumbfounded guys screamed that the lich was dangerous, and they needed to run. A powerful stream of energy flew at Bob. Pink mana emanated from the monster's finger. Watching the fight, the mercenaries screamed that Bob was killed. The exit was blocked. Holding his hands in front of himself, the lich said that in a normal situation they would not be able to get there. He allowed them. Magic chains held the protagonists back. While the ghost said that he was in a very good mood, now there was an offering better than the ogre chimera. The man was also shackled. The lich approached him and grabbed his hood. The monster with glowing eyes declared that the day of his prayers was coming. Drawing his sword, the protagonist thought about how the battle was over before it even began. The protagonist watched as the enemy released mana and thought that the Dark Mage had killed everyone, including dozens of SS-ranked mercenaries. Looking at his chained ally, he thought about how Baron, who was standing in front of the Great Mage, was cut in half in an instant. His lifeless body rolled to the floor, and even Xian was easily captured. The boy lay in chains on the ground, wondering why he was in such a state. Remembering how he looked at his palm, Chuck thought about how everything seemed different in this life, as if he had grown from a larva and a cicada, that he had become something more. The protagonist looked ahead in surprise. The man was desperately lying on the ground. The protagonist was chained and thought he was still a larva. Through a blurry vision, he looked at Pascan. The Dark Mage stood in front of the suspended guy, asking if he was awake yet. He smirked and said that he was welcome to his workshop. Chuck clenched his teeth in panic, listening to him say that there was no point in struggling, he would not be able to break these chains. The enemy approached him with a laugh. Frowning, the protagonist listened to him say that this may sound strange, but he wants to become a woman. Introducing a pregnant girl, Preston said that women are amazing, they have a power that no alchemist could reproduce. He tried everything, but did not become a woman. Raising his hands, the skeleton said that magic failed him, and he gave his soul and flesh in exchange for eternity, because only with an infinite amount of time can he find answers. Looking at the tools on the wall, the mage said that he had found a solution to this problem. The lich smiled and said that although he himself could not create life, he knew a way to create it. He wanted to give birth to life. The protagonist looked at him in shock. Approaching him, Preston said that today was a very good day. The mage extended his hand to the guy's face, saying that once in the past he met a friend with bad karma. He turned out to be Prescan, who was not under his control. The skeleton stroked his head and said that if he used someone like him, a person with bad karma, as an offering. Opening his palm, he said that in this case, he might come closer to fulfilling his dream. The lich held the protagonist's face. The protagonist opened his eyes in fear. His face was enveloped in dark mana. He was sweating in panic. The guy imagined a huge eyeball hanging above him. Chuck clenched his teeth in panic. Raising his hands, the mage said that he was offering it. The protagonist sighed in fear. The enemy looked at him in surprise. Spreading his arms out to the sides, he asked what was this. It was impossible. Why all of a sudden? The skeleton looked ahead in alarm and said that it was impossible. Preston stood in front of the victim. The shackled protagonist tried to catch his breath. Looking up, the mage asked if he had declined the invitation. He suddenly grabbed the guy by the throat. Frowning, the skeleton asked who he was, why the demonic king of terror had rejected him. Chuck grinned and listened that a soul with bad karma like his was worth a lot as an offering, but why he had not been accepted, wondering how he should know. The lich approached him and asked who he was, adding that he had to look into his memories. He looked at the guy's brain and asked to show him everything. The protagonist rolled his eyes. The protagonist sat on the floor, and we are told that when he woke up, the lich was gone. He was trying to catch his breath, and the plot told us that the guy sighed with relief, realizing that he was alive. But the next moment, Chuck looked ahead with alarm. The protagonist was sitting in a dark space. Lowering his head, the protagonist said that it was very noisy. The man smiled. The dark mage looked at him furiously. The guy bared his teeth in anger. He remembered the face of his killed ally. Clutching his head, Chuck thought about the fact that the sounds of cicadas that disappeared after killing the ogre chimera returned. The protagonist stood up on the ground, thinking that he was able to move soon. The dumbfounded protagonist looked down, thinking that it was not the experience of this life that was to blame, but the experience of working as a third-rate mercenary, tempering his will in an endless fight for life and the promises he made to his friends. Remembering tired Mia and happy girlfriends, he thought that he promised them not to die. The guy looked down sadly and said that he would never die. Looking at the spear, Chuck thought that he was used to this, the usual return to the past, regrets, shame and self-flagellation. These were the only three things he allowed himself to have when he survived. Dumbfounded, the protagonist listened to someone asking that he did not know who he was, but whether he could hear him, and thought that this was a signal transmission or telepathy. The protagonist stood in the room, clarifying who it was, why he was talking to him through telepathy. Lloyd sat in the dark and told him that he was the owner of the Golden Magic Tower, located underground, right under him. The guy looked ahead in surprise, thinking that someone seemed to stir up the water, and memories popped up in his head. The owner of the Golden Magic Tower, a great magician, in the past he disappeared at some point. Chuck stood quietly, thinking that it seemed like it happened around this time, and asked what he wanted. Bleeding, the man said that he was seriously injured and could not move. Let him help him get out of this place. Frowning, the protagonist listened that it was probably about Preskin. He ran away, and asked if it was safe below. The protagonist walked forward and asked why he should believe the stranger. Lloyd sat in a pile of stones and answered that he swears by his mana, if his words are true, and he helps him, he will reward him well. Lowering his head, the guy said that he agrees. Chuck walked through the cave, listening that fortunately, he was not too late. Smiling, the man said that when he felt someone's presence in the dungeon, he grabbed the last straw and contacted him. He was lucky. The protagonist looked at the wounded man, thinking that the battle, judging by the traces, was not small. He opened his eyes wide. The guy froze in panic. Chuck stood in front of the man's corpse. Taken aback, the protagonist asked what exactly happened here. Lloyd sat behind him and answered that it was not important now, let him quickly come and help him, he would tell him the details later. The protagonist was stretching his neck. He lowered his head, but asked what he needed help with. The man extended his finger and said that he needed help getting out of the dungeon. He pointed to the hovering heart. Having examined the organ surrounded by mana, Lloyd asked to destroy this thing. Frowning, the guy clarified what kind of nonsense this was. Chuck examined the mana coming from the heart. Listening to how dangerous it was, they needed to get rid of it. The protagonist quickly held out his spear. The organ bounced off the blow. Tentacles appeared from the heart. The protagonist looked at them in shock. He confidently held the spear. The tip of the weapon was surrounded by dark energy. The guy was taken aback. Chuck looked down at the heart in his chest, and the system reported that he had acquired a black heart. The plot moves us to a few hours earlier before getting the heart, when the skeleton raised his hand. He ran through the tunnel, wondering who he was, and we were told that he tripped while running. We were shown the brain in the head of the protagonist, and were told that the Lich used magic that destroys a person's consciousness to extract Chuck's memories, but for some reason it did not reflect. Stunned, Preskin thought about how other magic worked without misfires, but only the one that reads memories reflected. The mage rested his hands on the wall, thinking that even the demonic king of terror refused to accept him. He was badly injured and spent too much mana. The skeleton stood in front of three lying men. He looked at the floating hearts. Preskin smirked. Looking at the organs above the boys' bodies, the Lich said that he needed these guys to restore mana. The man on the ground frowned. We see a pile of stones where a scream was heard that enough was enough. The skeleton was strangling an old man. Standing in front of the exhausted men, he said that he was feeling a little better now. The mage looked down. Looking at the prone man, the Lich asked if the charming wretch had decided to feign sleep. Xian bit his lip in panic. Getting up from the ground, he asked if he would do the same to him as he had done to them. Preskin glared and said that he would be of much more use for a soul of that level again. Taken aback, Lloyd asked what he wanted to do. The man crossed his arms and said that it seemed he was still doing this disgusting and disrespectful research. He smirked and said that it had been 10 years and he had finally found it. Lloyd stood in front of him, telling him that he looked SOSO, asking if he had taken a lot of damage or something. Raising his hand, the man said that it was great, it would make his job easier, first destroy his body, and then slowly search for his life force vessel. Xian happily stood in front of him and cried out that he was the master of the Golden Magic Tower and a great mage. Smiling, the guy said that he would help him, they should destroy this evil together. Lloyd raised an eyebrow in displeasure and replied that he was not strong enough to help, let him just stay out of the way. Standing in front of his opponent, Preskin wondered what the hell was going on today. The demonic king of terror rejected his offering, and this monster found it. He imagined 2 floating hearts. Looking at the rotating organ, the Lich thought that it was not completely finished, but he had no choice. The skeleton flew up surrounded by dark energy. Taken aback, Lloyd asked what was with the flow of this mana, what did he create? Preskin's body transformed and he said that since he was so interested, this was what he had dreamed of, the result of his research. The Lich looked at him with madness and said that this was the highest stage of evolution. Small particles scattered to the sides. A woman's leg appeared. Lloyd looked forward in shock. A girl appeared in front of him. Prexkin smiled and thought that he was far from finished. The heart and physical body were not ready yet, but one heart was still there. Looking at the standing girl, he thought that nothing bad would happen if he used this unfinished product to overcome this crisis. Later he would complete the work on the perfect heart. Raising his hand, the man shouted that this was a useless effort. He would win with this. Lloyd created an energy essence above himself. Pointing his finger forward, the Lich ordered to take care of him, this fool. The man directed the flow of mana. The girl looked at the light in confusion. She stood in front of the accumulation of energy. Lloyd was taken aback, thinking that his magic had worn off. Preskin looked at her and said that she was doing well. The girl turned around and said that she was hungry. Looking at the surprised guy, she said that she was very hungry. Xian looked ahead confused. We see his back, from which a crunch was heard. Blood was seeping through his clothes. The girl tore out his heart, and the plot told us that this is how the captain of the strongest mercenary guild in Bihanger, close to becoming the supreme master of martial arts, fell dead, not even having time to realize that his heart was torn out. The guy was lying in a pool of blood. The girl opened her mouth, and we were told that what happened next was pure madness. Lloyd looked ahead in fear. Preskin laughed with a grin. The daughter licked her bloody fingers. Frowning, the man thought that she was a monster. Looking at the ceiling, he said that the battle continued. He spent all his mana on the girl, after which the Lich ran away with her, probably. When they ran away, they felt relief, seeing him wounded without a drop of mana. Lloyd sat on the bed and said that this was all that happened there. Once again he was grateful for the help and salvation. The protagonist calmly looked at him. Remembering how he sat in the cave, the man said that he was grateful for the destruction of that heart. The protagonist imagined the dark organ. Grinning, he listened that the man did not see this, because after his speech he immediately lost consciousness, and answered that he did what he had to. The guy smiled, wondering why this thing was inside his body. Raising his finger, Lloyd said that he would give him any desired thing that he could get. Chuck frowned, thinking that there was a guarantee of the fulfillment of a wish from the great magician, but for now he did not need anything, so he would leave the reward for later. The protagonist sat in front of the happy man, thinking that if he knew that he had absorbed the heart, he would have tried to kill him that very second. Preskin was the master of the Black Magic Tower, but he had broken the prohibitions, so he was ordered to be killed. Imagining how the Lich held the man's head, the protagonist thought that the master of the Golden Magic Tower had gone on a mission. He imagined the guy's movement pattern, thinking that at the end of a 10-year search, he was lucky to stumble upon a raid. In his past life, he probably died in that cave. The guy remembered Lloyd sitting in the stones, thinking that the raid began later, so he went missing. Frowning, Chuck thought that due to regression, the dead man was alive. The protagonist angrily lowered his eyebrows. Remembering the turned-away man, the protagonist thought that alive is dead. He stood surrounded by dark mana. Imagining the smiling man, the guy thought that he was a frog at the bottom of a well. The hero in his world was Xian. Chuck imagined evil mages and a girl. Remembering the frog in the well, the protagonist thought that they could kill many monsters with a wave of their hand. His heaven was just a small grain of sand on a huge mountain. Lowering his head, the protagonist thought that somewhere there is always a wider view. He remembered his girlfriend turned away, wondering what level Chloe had already reached. Clenching his fist, the guy thought that he should just admit it. He was nothing more than a larva. He knew it already on Mount Mercer. Chuck sadly walked down the street, thinking that it was funny to despair over something that was not given. He would gradually crawl the path of a larva. Mike stood behind him and said that he could not believe that he met him here. The guy smiled and said that he heard that most of the raid died, but he managed to come back alive. He looked worried and said that this armor was a rather unusual artifact. Standing in front of the protagonist, Mike asked if he could take a look at it. The protagonist calmly replied that he also had something to ask. The guy sat at the table, saying that this was a forced contract type of armor. It contacts a transcendent demon king or demon god. Touching his chest, he said that this evil armor skips the formal part of the contract and forces its owner to agree to slave conditions. Mike drew people on the board, saying that let's say there is a third-rate martial artist, and let him have the potential to become a supreme martial artist. If he puts on the demon armor, his potential will awaken, and he will become a supreme martial artist. Turning around, the boy said that after death, his soul would belong to the demon king, and all this regardless of the user's wishes. While wiping the board, he listened to how nothing happened to him when he put on the armor, and answered that it was very interesting. Mike said with a serious expression that there were two options, or he had no potential. Standing in front of a serious friend, the guy said that either a contract was made with a creature stronger than the owner of the demonic armor. Turning around, he said that he was betting on the latter and asked if he had anyone in mind. The protagonist was taken aback, thinking that the Lich was asking why the demonic king of horror rejected him. Mike sent mana into him and said that if a contract was not made, then he could easily use the armor. Several useful spells were cast on it. The protagonist watched as the armor glowed. Looking at his hand, he heard that under normal conditions he could wear them as a bracelet, fill them with mana or internal energy, and the armor would return to its original appearance. Putting his hand to his chest, Mike said that the demonic king of horror is a transcendental creature of a very high level. With his gaze he causes horror in any creature below the level. Imagining the eye watching the guys, he said that the protagonist retained his sanity even when he looked at it, and even he could not accept it as an offering. The guy grinned, asking if he now understood what was going on. Chuck silently looked around the room. Frowning, the protagonist asked if his soul was really a level higher than the demonic king of horror. The protagonist looked worried. Mike sat at the table, listening to him absorb something strange and asking if the heart was black, if it was made by Preskin. The interlocutor looked seriously and answered that he himself did not know for sure, but did not feel any alien energy inside. Imagining the skeleton's hand reaching for the heart, the guy said that the Lich was conducting research on a higher form of life, if the heart is a product of desire. He brought his hand to the bracelet and said that in this case, he could get many times more benefit from it than from the armor. The guy extended his finger and said that he could not give a better answer. The protagonist was taken aback when he heard that, however, God could. The protagonist imagined the girl smiling and saying that if he wanted to go through the trials, he should go to Dreamer and meet the god of time, Dinner, and wondered if God could answer his question. Smiling, Mike said that it was not difficult for him, he could come anytime. He looked at him seriously and said that he really liked him. The guy grimaced in displeasure, answering with agreement. Chuck closed the door. Looking down, the protagonist thought about how much he had learned from the conversation with Mike. He had even more questions. The protagonist dodged the blow, deciding that he needed to go to Dreamer. The girl swung her leg. Raising her knee, she said that she told him not to mess with him. The guy held his neck and asked why she always hit him every time, since she was a mage. Frowning, Scarlet said that she should not seek goodness from this guy. Chuck looked at her sadly, listening to her say that it was better to ask her questions. How dare he be impudent? The protagonist looked at the furious girl and asked how old she was. Scarlet was surrounded by dark mana from anger. She waved her fist and said that women should not be asked such questions. The girl turned to him, telling him that she heard that he was the only one who survived the raid, and asked if he was okay. Remembering Xian's corpse, the protagonist answered that he was fine. His girlfriend looked at him with concern. Turning his head, the guy said that he was going to Dreamer, he had some business there. Smiling, Scarlet cried out that they would go together then. She threw her hands behind her head and said that she also had business in Dreamer, asking if it would not be better to go there with a good company. The guy shuddered in panic, answering that it was not so, he was glad. Sweating, Chuck thought about how this wasn't really true. Imagining the girl surrounded by flames, the protagonist thought that he wouldn't mind going with her. She was a genius with unique magic, the founder of the Lesire School and the future owner of the Crimson Magic Tower. The protagonist sat on the edge of the bed, thinking that being friends with such a person would only benefit him. He lowered his head, wondering why people were so kind to him if the attraction came from something behind him. Imagining a crowd of guys, the guy decided that all his relationships were fake. Chuck put his hand on his knee, wondering if Lud joined the raid because of this, then wouldn't his death be in vain? The protagonist sat on the bed and thought that for now he only had a suspicion and no evidence. But if this was really the case, and Scarlet decided to join him on the road because of something like this. Imagining the girl's corpse, the protagonist thought what if something went wrong and she met Lud's fate. He lowered his head, thinking that he would not be able to forgive himself then. That was why he did not want to go with her. Remembering how he stood in the cave, the guy thought about how when he saved Lloyd and received the Black Heart, he searched Sion's corpse. Chuck imagined the face of his dead friend, thinking that he definitely kept everything valuable to himself. He found amazing things. The protagonist imagined pills and books, thinking that he had a small and large energy pill and a secret Shaolin manual on the highest level martial arts. The protagonist picked up the pill, deciding that these were all priceless things. Throwing the pill into his mouth, he thought that anxiety can wait. First he needs to become stronger. The guy swallowed, thinking that he first needs to pass the energy through the body. Chuck frowned. The protagonist sat on the bed. The protagonist stood up in surprise. Imagining the man swallowing the pill and sitting, he thought about what was happening. No changes were felt. Usually when someone drinks a small energy pill, the internal energy of the elixir rages inside the body. Dumbfounded, the guy thought that it was really fake. Chuck looked at the glow in his stomach in surprise. Remembering the smiling Xian, the protagonist thought that to sum it up, his internal energy had increased many times over. The small energy pill was not fake. Usually when a person drinks an elixir, the internal energy of the elixir begins to burst out. The protagonist stood surrounded by mana and thought that in order to successfully absorb it, he needed to make it circulate inside. But he did not have to do this. He managed to absorb all the internal energy of the weak energy pill. Raising his fiery hand, he thought about how difficult it was to absorb even a part, but he managed to absorb it all. The guy looked at him in surprise, thinking about what happened then. Chuck imagined a heart inside his chest. Chuck turned to look at the open box. Picking up the box, the protagonist thought that it was a large energy pill. The surprised protagonist was enveloped in a stream of energy. Grinning, he thought about how he managed to perfectly absorb the internal energy of both the small and large energy pills. He was almost on par with the supreme martial artist in internal energy. The guy imagined a dark organ, thinking why he could effectively absorb it without loss. Could it be the influence of the black heart? Chuck stood in the room and reasoned that he did not know for sure, but it was incredibly beneficial. He was able to replenish his eternal lack of internal energy. The protagonist took the books, deciding that he needed to take care of them. The protagonist looked at him in surprise. A light bulb went off in his mind. Scarlet crossed her arms and asked him if he was going to Breton instead of Dreamer. The guy bowed and replied that it meant he couldn't go with her. He stood in front of his surprised friend and told her that it was because he had received a secret martial arts manual from the Shaolin Temple, wanted to return it, and the Shaolin Temple was in Breton. Chuck imagined himself jumping over a stack of books and saying that he had already read it. There were plenty of similar manuals on the market. Scratching his head, the protagonist explained that it would be hard to sell it for its real price, so he intended to return the book to the Shaolin Temple and get a reward. The protagonist looked confused when he heard that this was why he couldn't go with her, and replied that she only had business in Dreamer. The girl smiled and said that she also had business in Breton. She put her hands on her hips and said that it wasn't really a big deal, she just wanted to see the world. Imagining herself happily in the mountains, Scarlet said that cities weren't really her thing, she preferred training in the mountains. The guy was taken aback when he heard that she was going to settle down somewhere for a while after the trip. The girl frowned and cried out that she was going to wash herself. The sun was shining on the roofs of the houses. Putting her arm around the guy's shoulder, Scarlet asked if it meant that they could go together. She tilted his head and said that he had agreed. Since he was nodding, he couldn't take his words back. Kneeling down, Chuck said that they would go together. Smiling, Scarlet said that she would just close all the questions in a week. The protagonist sat with a dented face, thinking that he needed to think about this in a positive way. He could talk to her on the way, and it was unlikely that something bad would happen if they were alone. The girl walked along the grass and asked who he was. She stopped in front of the guys. The protagonist stood tensely in front of his companion. Extending her hand, the stranger said that after meeting him. Tentacles appeared from her hand. She raised a huge paw, continuing to say that she had such strange sensations. Light emanated from her chest. Dumbfounded, the guy listened as the stranger asked who he was. A little earlier. The night sky against the background of the forest. The Lich, with his hands folded on his knees, thinks that Lloyd is too strong. Lloyd looks, raising his hand. The Lich continues to think that he barely survived and that such monsters are called geniuses. The magician lowered his head and thought that if he had not awakened him in time, he would hardly have left alive. The girl stood with her back turned. He called her child. Lloyd looked at her back in surprise. Lloyd screamed, calling her. She did not react at all. She sat up. The girl's hands and face were covered in blood. He reasoned that apparently because of the rush to wake up, he still did not control her very well, and that she did not listen to his orders. Lloyd clenched his teeth and thought about the fact that at least she did not attack him, and that meant the obedience seal worked fine. The magician approached her and asked if she remembered what he said. His heart's where she first opened. Lloyd asked if she would find him. The girl stood up looking forward attentively. He clarified whether she would return soon. The magician, angry, pointed his finger and said that good, then let her follow him. The girl ran into the forest. The magician looked after her and reasoned about where she went. She just goes wherever she wants. Amanda ran and thought about her father asking to go to another place. There was something strange there. The girl was beating in her chest. She thought that her heart was beating very hard and it was strange. Chuck followed Scarlet and thought about what this feeling was. He turned around and thought how bad it was. A foot stepped out of the darkness. Amanda stood and asked who he was. The guy looked calmly and heard the heartbeat. Suddenly, a monster like a worm appeared in front of him. Chuck opened his eyes wide in horror. He watched as a substance hung over the girl. A magic ball grew in Scarlet's hand and she screamed what he was doing, calling him an idiot. She launched an energy ball at the monster. Anya's tentacles burned from the impact. Scarlet screamed for Chuck to pull himself together if he did not want to die. He clasped his hand on his chest and apologized, saying that his heart suddenly. The girl was taken aback, asking again. Amanda was sitting on one knee. Scarlet said what this child was. Chuck, gritting his teeth, furiously said that this was the Lich's chimera, which Lloyd had talked about, and asked why she was here, whether she was here to return the heart. Xion was lying on the ground and the guy remembered that she killed Xion without blinking an eye. Lloyd was sitting unconscious. Chuck added that even the great mage Lloyd barely survived a meeting with her, although he was also fighting the Lich at the same time. The bracelet on his hand lit up and the guy wondered if he could handle it. Scarlet lit up behind him. He imagined her death and thought that he should handle it. Chuck transformed and prepared to attack. Amanda spread her tentacle arms. The guy was the first to strike her. He was focused. Chuck abruptly blocked Anya's attack from behind. He pierced her long tentacles with a spear and said that this brat, noting that her attacks are not at all ordinary, and her fists hit harder than the ogre chimera. The guy held a weapon in his hand and reasoned that if he had not increased his internal energy with the help of an elixir, then this would have been damn problematic, and that how lucky he asked Jesse to lighten his armor. Now he can move much faster. Scarlet extended her finger and screamed for the idiot to move away. She attacked Anya with a fire strike. The girl spread her tentacles trying to block. She held the defense against her attack with effort. Scarlet hovered in the runes and said that it was quite painful, it must be very hot, and noted that she had strong magical resistance. Amanda writhed in pain, continuing to defend herself. Scarlet continued to tell her that although she could neutralize most spells, her magic was a little special. The girl raised a finger, claiming that normal magic resistance was useless against her. This was a secret magic specially perfected by her, and if she did not want to turn into coals, then quietly. She saw the approaching danger. Chuck shielded her from the blow. He saved her life and asked if his debt for helping her was repaid. Scarlet slowly answered that yes, of course. The hero, raising his head, was wary. Behind the girl stood Xian, who had just attacked. Chuck wondered if this was really 100 steps of the mystical fist. He remembered Anya, whose entire face was covered in blood, and assumed that Lloyd had mentioned that she had eaten Xian's heart. The hero attacked the girl, wondering if she was able to absorb abilities. Chuck got angry, looking at her, and called her a monster. The guy looked at Anya with hatred. She attacked the hero. Amanda threw a punch, but Chuck stopped her, blocking her with his spear, thinking that he could neither parry nor defend himself. In the heat of the fight, the girl screamed that she had asked a question and why he was not answering it. Anya's eyes were filled with shock. She asked who the hell he was. The hero continued to defend himself with an impassive face. Suddenly, a fireball struck and the heroes flew away. Scarlet's finger was smoking, and she said that she had attached the stars of luck to her and advised her to read them, calling her baby. Anya's face was burning, but she continued to stand on her feet. The girl raised her finger and noted how angry she was and suggested trying to kill her since she had so many emotions. Amanda clenched her teeth in fury. She opened her eyes wide, surprised. Hands came out of the ground and grabbed her legs. Scarlet grinned and added that of course, if she could. Chuck, taking advantage of the moment, quickly attacked the chimera. The spear was flying straight at her. She noticed it. Amanda cut off her own legs with her own tentacles and dodged the attack. Chuck opened his mouth and asked. She cut off her own legs. The chimera flew with cut off limbs to the ground. She curled up into a ball. Amanda landed on her newly appeared legs and arms. Chuck and Scarlet were shocked by what they saw. The girl stood in front of them. As if nothing had happened, the heroes discussed that her limbs immediately regenerated. Scarlet grabbed her head and screamed that she was just a monster, even what she burned perfectly restored, and this irritated her. The heroes looked at the chimera. The guy asked that this situation only irritated her. The girl answered that it did. Scarlet took a lock of hair and added that even perfect regeneration will have limitations, and if the mana runs out, it will stop too. Chuck looked at her, discouraged. The girl said that having faced her in battle, she realized that if they fought her together, they would have a chance, or rather, they would be able to continue to damage her. Amanda stood calmly to the side, and Scarlet continued to say that sooner or later her mana would run out and victory would be theirs. Chimera watched, smirking. The heroes watched as the girl enveloped everything around her with her magic. The girl calmly said that she was taking her words back. Amanda prepared for battle by pulling out her tentacles. Scarlet continued to say that she had an infinite amount of mana and that they were in big trouble. The girl attacked Chuck. He missed the blow in horror. The guy lay to the side, trying to get up. Scarlet asked if he was okay. She angrily screamed that this idiot could not die. Chuck slowly rose, bleeding. He thought about what he had to change, and he changed. He changed and changed the world around him. This is what he achieved on Mount Mercer, but it was not enough. Chloe looked at him calmly. He continued to think about what he dreamed of, the unattainable. A larva can only crawl. The larva lay motionless on the ground. Chuck thought if one step is not enough, then he needs to take tens or hundreds of steps, but he could not. He looked at his hand and thought that one step was enough for him, Mount Mercer. The truth is that he left it not only because of the demonic armor. The man looks up the slope. He says that he ran into a wall that seemed insurmountable to him. The armor glowed red and said that he gave up, tempted by an easier way. The demonic armor was just an excuse to leave the mountain. The memory of a cheerful Harvey with him continued that the price was too high. Chuck almost stood up, leaning on the spear, reasoning that he was useless and worthless, so he had to fight, but then he ran away, which he should not have done. The guy picked up the spear, thinking that it was heavy, and that he had not felt the weight of the spear for so long and the constant noise of the cicada. He gritted his teeth in pain, talking about these cicadas. Chloe stood with her back turned. Chuck thought he wanted to stand shoulder to shoulder with her. short-haired girl from the back. He wanted to change his fate. Amanda attacked Scarlet. He continued to think that he did not want to die. The girl clenched her teeth, preparing to defend herself. His dream was too much for a normal larva. Chuck watched what was happening and thought that he did not want to die. He thought that he definitely did not want to die and that it was almost impossible for him today. The hero screamed and thought that if the wind took possession of him, which he did not deserve, was much stronger than him. Amanda was calm and consistent. The protagonist reasoned that he would need to step forward again and again. He pointed his spear and prepared to attack. Screaming again, Chuck struck with all his might. The attack was strong and Amanda was surprised. Scarlet watched in horror what was happening. The guy clenched his teeth and gave all of himself. Amanda screamed furiously about who the hell he was. He was exhausted and tried to say that he was Chuck. The guy pierced her with a spear. The girl was bleeding. She looked into his eyes and said her name. Scarlet ran up to Chuck, grabbing his hand. Anya was bleeding from her mouth. She was calm. The chimera turned towards the forest. The heroes watched as she quickly ran away from them. The guy bent down, bleeding and lost consciousness. Chuck opened his eyes and saw a wooden ceiling. He was lying on a pillow in a bed. He jumped up abruptly and asked Scarlet, who was reading, where he was. She asked in response that he was already awake. The girl slammed the book shut and said that fortunately he did not die, but only lay unconscious for 3 days and that they were in a nearby village. She said that a doctor examined him and she used earth to heal external wounds, asking how he felt. Chuck tried to move and replied that he did not feel any stiffness in his movements. Scarlet jumped up from her seat and kicked him, telling the idiot to stop being so brave and whether he knew how many bones he had broken. The guy thought about something, and the girl continued asking, "What do you mean he claims to have fully recovered in 3 days?" Chuck wondered if this could also be the effect of the black heart. Scarlet, crossing her arms, calmly watched Chuck. She took off her glasses and asked about the fact that he was not telling her something. He imagined Anya in front of him. The girl continued asking what kind of monster this was and said that it seemed like he knew something. Scarlet lost her temper and started screaming at him to inject and not hide anything from her. Chuck looked ahead unwaveringly and told her everything. She said that she understood everything, the black heart. The heroes were sitting on the bed and the girl asked why he went to the Psycho John. The guy answered that yes. Scarlet raised her hands behind her head and added that he survived hell and received a piece of mana with incredible power. She does not even know whether he was lucky or not. The girl turned to him and added that no, he was unlucky, because if she had not imposed herself on him, he would have died. Chuck agreed with her. He sat and looked thoughtfully ahead. Scarlet raised her knee and asked what his reaction was, and where his gratitude was. She looked at him disappointedly, and he asked why she did not run away at that moment. The heroes were sitting on the bed and Chuck noted that in that situation she could have died, her goal was only him, and that she could have run away. He turned his head to her and repeated this asking why she did not run away. Scarlet looked with offended eyes and answered asking again that he wanted to know why she did not leave him to die. Chuck objected that it was not so. She got up from the bed and continued that she did not want to do that. The hero looked at her with guilty eyes. Scarlet stepped aside and put her hand on her head. She froze in this pose and uttered, asking if he had been through the war. He let go of his head and answered that he had not. The girl answered that she thought so. Chuck looked at her and listened, about how when she was younger, before she became so sexy and was just a damn cute child. There was a sword and blood on the Morning Star. She continued that she did not know where or when, but suddenly the war began. The girl bowed her head and said that war was disgusting, because it burned everything dear to her on its way, her hometown and all the people. The heroine remembered how she, as a little girl, looked at the ruins of the city. Chuck listened carefully, watching her. She stood with her back to him and told him that it was hard to get used to the emptiness in her heart, and that was why she never got close to anyone. Scarlet turned around abruptly and added that she could do nothing. It all happened before her eyes and she couldn't leave him alone. She looked at him with sympathy and claimed that she knew that expression. He asked if he had lost anyone before. Chuck was upset and hung his head. Scarlet cheerfully cried out that he shouldn't worry about the little things, because she was still alive. She leaned closer to him and said that she had survived the war and all the difficulties on her way and luck was on her side. Chuck remembered how Amanda attacked Scarlet and asked that she had been on the brink of death. The girl smiled and replied that she had her best technique hidden for such cases. She would have survived even if he hadn't caught the last attack. Remembering how Chuck bowed, she continued asking him that he was traveling alone because he was afraid that people around him would die. She said that she would give him advice as an older woman. Scarlet pointed her finger and said that if he didn't want to lose important people, then he just needed to become stronger. She pointed her finger at him and screamed for him to become so strong that he would never be in danger again, and added that she was doing the same. Chuck listened to her silently, sitting on the bed. He smiled and asked how anyone didn't know that. The girl answered that yes, it was quite obvious. There was a net on the window. She asked if he was better, Chuck answered that it was definitely so. Scarlet turned around and said that since he seemed to understand her words, then she would go, let him gain strength, because they were leaving for Breton tomorrow. Chuck jumped out of bed and thanked her. In response, the girl waved her hand and told him not to overdo it. The guy smiled silently. He thought, to become stronger, raised the knife above himself, adding that he also knows it. Chuck looked at the knife, shifting it in his hand. He remembered that at the last moment, what was released from his spear was amplified energy. The guy saw how the knife lit up with a pink light. Looking at it, he thought that yes, he did not need to think about useless things. Chuck raised the blade above himself, and reasoned that he would continue to become stronger. Scarlet, smiling, exclaimed that they had finally arrived. She, throwing her arms out to the sides, enjoyed the view of the city. They were talking about Brendan. The houses stood like a wall, and she said that it was her first time in the city of the Central Plains, and it was good that they were not attacked anymore. The girl hugged Chuck and asked what they would do. Would they go to Shaolin right now? The guy answered that he had not decided yet. Scarlet looked at him and asked that since they were here, maybe they would rest a little, at least have a snack. The hero, nodding approvingly, agreed. A view of a spacious room with a staircase to the second floor, where people were. Chuck was sitting at the table and asked what was best to take. The girl jumped up and answered that she did not know. She thoughtfully put her finger to her chin and said that she was not familiar with the local food and had never eaten dishes from the Central Plains, and even more so. Two men were sitting at a table nearby. They were quite tense. She added that she didn't know what to do with these flies bastards. The men were looking at the heroes from above, from the balcony. Chuck asked if the girl felt it too. She answered positively. The bald man looked away in fear. Scarlet continued that they were looking at them from head to toe as soon as they entered, and it was impossible not to feel it. The girl sat opposite Chuck and, sighing, asked why they were doing this shit. The hero leaned over a little and answered that it was all because of him. Scarlet asked again. The two people laughed, closing their eyes, and it was said that when a martial artist reaches the highest level, his essence changes, and because of this, his vast reserve of internal energy is not visible to others. The hero stood with his spear pointed in front of him. It was reported that Chuck met one of the criteria, the amount of energy, but did not fit the others. He had not yet become a full-fledged supreme master of martial arts. Scarlet looked in surprise and asked a question about his internal energy overflowing and attracting those guys. The man walked to the edge of the balcony and, looking at the heroes, questioningly exclaimed what she said. Did she call them flies? He, thinking, pulled his hand to his face and said that for a beauty, the language is sharp, and although perhaps this zest makes her more attractive. Scarlet reluctantly looked up and insultingly asked what he was talking about. Chuck looked at her in surprise. She continued, asking if all the screws in his head were in place. The man, putting his hand to his forehead, noted that, as expected, the beautiful flower has sharp thorns. The girl asked him to shut up and asked a question about what his mother taught him to say from novels. The girl threatened with her finger and said that she was serious. He better get back to eating and not talk nonsense, because every word brings him closer to death, and her hands are itching. The man turned red with rage. Chuck, looking at him, said that it seems he is furious. The girl asked again why. The man grabbed the sword in his hands and screamed angrily, giving him one last chance to take his words back. The hero sat in place, looking at him. The girl asked that if he does not take it, what will this idiot do to her? The man, furious, jumped down and attacked her. The girl said that she was scared, asking Chuck to save her. The guy did not take his eyes off what was happening and thought, he is a master of martial arts, about the first class, and why should she pick a fight? The man glowed with magic and flew down to them. He received a blow from the side. The hero looked at him in surprise and couldn't believe what was happening. He looked at the stranger standing in front of him with a coin in his hand, who calmly asked if it was okay to behave like that in a tavern. The man flipped a coin and said that he was bad at judging and that there was no point in rushing at an opponent who was much stronger than him. Chuck looked at the opponent lying on the floor. About the coin, he knocked him out with it. The hero looked at the man calmly and asked who he was. The man folded his hands in greeting and apologized, saying that he didn't want the corpse to bother the waiters, and that his name was Nigel, the rising star of the Namgun clan, the dragon swordsman, Nigel. The heroes looked at him carefully, and Scarlet remembered that clan, which was full of strong martial artists. Chuck looked intently and thought about his name. The guy sat at the table and said that in fact he was not going to kill him. Nigel accepted it indifferently. He asked if he could sit with them. Scarlet leaned on the chair and said that if he paid for them, because the Namgun clan was rich. He laughed in response and agreed. Nigel sat at the table and stared at the hero. Chuck could not resist and asked why he was staring at him so. He smiled and asked in response how old the hero was. The guy answered that he was 18. Nigel smiled and said that he was so young and practically the highest master of martial arts. Chuck took a sip from the glass. The man continued that this was very impressive. He thought he was no slouch himself, but he met an even more incredible talent. He asked if this was by any chance the lesser heavenly demon, Chloe. Chuck choked and spat out everything from his mouth. The boy bowed his head and heard Nigel continue to talk about how isn't it that when he thinks about his peers, this is the only monster with a similar level of martial arts, and asked if he knows a minor heavenly demon. Chuck turned and cried out inquiringly if he knows a minor heavenly demon, and Nigel replied that he is quite a famous person. The bloody heavenly demon. Baek Woozen stood shrouded in magic, and the man said that in area there are only 3 martial artists who are called heavenly demons. The monster was tearing apart its opponent. It was the heavenly demon Berserker, Baek Wonpei. Nigel watched carefully and said that the minor heavenly demon, Chloe, and if we judge his strength based on his nickname, then you might think that he is weaker, but this is not the case. Scarlet furiously pounced on the hero with her feet. The man finished that it turns out he is not a heavenly demon. Chuck hit his head on the table and heard some people say that he was a girl. Nigel raised his hand and calmly asked him, who was he? The same age as the lesser heavenly demon and the owner of amazing martial arts. The guy with the bump on his head replied that he was Chuck. The man said that he had never heard of him. Chuck sternly asked him if he knew anything else about the lesser heavenly demon. The man remained calm and replied that he had told him everything he knew. He continued to say that if he wanted to know anything else, he should ask around, because they said that he had a tough character. Chuck listened to him intently. Nigel got up from the table and told him that he would like to spar with him. The guy asked again. The man laughed and added that he should not think anything bad. It was just that the spirit of competition awakens in him when he sees a worthy martial artist. Chuck thought that a fight with a strong opponent would help him overcome the plateau in his development that he had encountered. He smiled, nodded, and said that he would agree to a friendly fight. Nigel laughed and said that it was just great. There was a red lamp hanging on the ceiling. The man said that just sparring is pretty boring and offered to bet something. Chuck looked at him in surprise and asked if he wanted to bet on something. Nigel said yes. How about something not very serious? The man cheerfully cried out that, for example, the loser would become the winner's brother. The legs of the hero and the man walked side by side. They came to the ring, standing opposite each other. Nigel asked if his opponent was ready. The guy held the weapon to his head and said that he was unlikely to live up to his expectations. The man, closing his eyes, laughed. Energy accumulated around Nigel and he noted that he was too modest. Chuck watched and thought that his energy aura had completely changed, and it was not for nothing that he had become the strongest of the Namgun clan in his past life. The hero watched carefully and thought that he was strong, at least a martial artist. Nigel raised his golden sword ready. Chuck wondered that he was the supreme master. Scarlet was sitting on the floor. The man was lifting his feet off the floor, moving them. He was moving around the ring from side to side. The hero thought that these were strange foot movements, and if he hesitated, he would lose the rhythm and thought to attack first. The plot says about the flight of the soul, devoid of shadow, the first form. The hero attacked the man with a lightning strike. Chuck was close, holding a spear at Nigel's head. The man reasoned that he had increased his speed and now his illusory steps were not a problem, and got so close despite the spear in his hands. The man knocked Chuck's weapon aside with his sword and said he liked it. The spear seemed to stick to the sword, glowing with energy. The hero thought it was sucking him in, an energy absorption technique. Chuck gritted his teeth and tried to resist. He swirled the spear around the man's sword. The hero struck the enemy's weapon, but did not knock it out. Nigel raised the sword above himself and froze in anticipation. This is about the Spear of 9 Heavens, the first form. Chuck launched a heartbreaking spear at him. The man swung his sword around. It knocked the hero's spear aside. Chuck looked at him, confused, wondering why he had put his sword away in the middle of the attack. Nigel looked at his weapon and said that a real spear would have hit him much harder. The man smiled, put his sword on his shoulder, and noted that he would have been in danger if he had been fooling around. He didn't really want to call someone younger than him an older brother. Chuck frowned, aimed the spear, and asked if this wasn't a better deal for him. He continued that since the man was older, he had nothing to lose either way. Scarlet watched the fight and thought that it was so boring, they should just end it already. Nigel asked if he had given it his all anyway, because martial artists don't like to lose. Chuck replied that of course he did. The man ran at him and shouted, "Okay, let's continue the game then." The hero leaned back. He used magic and threw a spear at the opponent, who only smirked. The man ducked and dodged the blow. Chuck was furious at what had happened. He struck again, but Nigel successfully blocked. The guy helplessly thought that the spear was stuck. It was an energy absorption technique. The man was relaxed and easily deflected the opponent's spear to the side. The guy was furious and thought, he did not want to admit it, but his control of internal energy was much better. He thought that the most effective way was to push him away with internal energy. Chuck knocked the sword out, hitting from below. Nigel tensed silently. The guy spun the spear. It was about the Spear of 9 Heavens, the second form. He attacked with a lightning-fast splitting blow at the opponent. The hero looked at him intently. The man thrust the sword, shattering the spear into splinters. The street shook from Nigel's blow. He extended the sword to the hero's throat and said that there were many movements only in appearance. But the original was the same for phantoms, and they only needed to find it and meet face to face. The man defeated his opponent and said that he had won. Chuck, narrowing his eyes, agreed that he had lost, calling Nigel his older brother. He tensed up so much that the veins on his neck popped out. The guy thought that he still had a long way to go. The man helped him get up and laughed, noting that he was still quite skilled. Chuck, getting up, replied that he had lost without a win. Nigel looked him in the eye and objected that no, the difference in their skills was not that big, as was the level with the amount of internal energy, and added that his mastery of the spear was truly amazing. The guy listened attentively, and the man continued that he was good at basic techniques, but more advanced ones were still lame. He asked, guessing that there probably weren't many opportunities to use them in a real fight, right? Recalling how the spear had stuck to the sword, he said that his control of internal energy was still poorly honed, and because of that, even in small clashes, he took too much damage. Nigel happily hugged Chuck and added that in general, he only won because of experience, and if he gained it, everything would be within his power. The man looked at him, still hugging him, and said that since they were now brothers, he hoped that he would keep him company. Chuck looked at him questioningly and asked where he was going. Nigel screamed loudly that he was going to the Shaolin Temple. The guy opened his mouth and screamed in response that he was going there. The man asked if this was true and noted that it was an amazing coincidence. Chuck agreed that it was indeed amazing. Scarlett, picking him up from the floor, asked why the boys were so noisy, adding that their boring fight was already over. She watched questioningly as the two hugged and laughed. The girl continued to watch in surprise and asked what was happening to them, and said that she didn't like it. The old man sat with his back turned and said that he felt himself approaching. The grandfather smiled and said that the almighty god of chaos was approaching. She asked why Nigel was going to Shaolin. The man calmly explained that about once a year he had to visit the Shaolin monk, Master William. He turned around and added that he was with the new generation of the other three respected clans. Chuck asked in confusion why he had to do this every year, and Scarlett, raising her finger, called him a loser. Nigel added, saying that it was because of an old promise, and that he would explain on the way. The hero answered positively. The girl, her eyes wide open in surprise, thought that the loser could talk. It is said that this is why they are going together. Not far from the mountains, in a beautiful place, there was the Shaolin Temple. The monk closed his eyes, in deep meditation. It is reported that the Namgun clan, the Chaegao clan, the Mon clan and the Tang clan, for respected clans, and their successors are peers with similar skills. Scarlett tried to hide from the bright light. The monk turned to the heroes. His head was shining brightly, so the girl could not look at him. It was said that more than once the heads of the clans made attempts to unite the clans. In front of them stood three characters who were waiting for something. The plot said that everything ended in an argument about who to give leadership to. It was difficult to decide when everyone was approximately equal in strength. The girl with a short haircut thoughtfully watched. It was said that they gave this problem to the next generation to solve. The hero with a bandage on his forehead closed his eyes, thinking. The plot explained that Monk William was chosen. The girl with green hair looked intently ahead. It is said that he will decide who will take the place of the leader. Nigel raised his hand up and exclaimed that the guys seemed to have to wait for some time. He added that he was delayed for some reason. While one of the characters asked about the reason for his lateness, Chuck watched attentively, and reasoned that he had heard about everyone in a past life. The guys asked that the reason is that guy? Let him tell about the improbability of his reason. Chuck's eyes became small, all attention was on him. The man smirked and asked again who she was calling a guy, adding that, apparently, there was something wrong with her eyes. The girl with the short hair was furious and asked what he said. Nigel hugged Chuck abruptly and continued that his little brother was not even 20 and was almost a top martial artist, asking if she understood now. She continued to shout questioningly that this was his brother, and he was such a gifted master. Chuck looked at her and understood everything. While the man hugged the boy, he looked at him with a serious face. Someone thought that since his brother was like this at 18, his status would increase. The three boys were perplexed and watched, silently. Chuck asked Nigel about why he wanted him to be his brother. The man, without letting go of his hand from his shoulder, answered that he probably would reach the top level someday. He continued to talk in his ear that being his brother did not have any disadvantages for him, and was not that the reason he accepted the bet. Chuck exhaled, agreeing. The man with the bandage asked how long they would have to wait for them. Nigel, hugging Chuck, raised his head and noted that it was definitely time to go. The man, leaving, turned to the guy and said that they would go to Master William, so he could rest somewhere here. Chuck agreed, calling him brother. The man went on with the others. The girl with green hair thoughtfully turned towards Nigel. He looked at her with loving eyes. Scarlett patted Chuck on the back and said that he was lucky, he lost the fight, but got such a reliable person as an ally. The guy irritably asked her to stop. She replied that it was so careless. The girl turned around and saw the monk behind her, who called them with him, said that they had prepared lunches for them. Scarlett thought that she really hoped that the food in the temple was delicious. She looked around the room. There were flowers painted on the wall. The heroes were sitting at the table and the girl, sorting through the food on her plate, sadly said that she understood that there was no meat here. Chuck objected that it was still a temple. They were having dinner and everyone was thinking about their own. Scarlet, chewing her food, was thinking that the taste was not rich but pleasant, and Chuck looked up. He was thinking that he needed to return the secret manual found at Xion's and return to Dreamer. The door opened and the monk entered, who called out to the hero. Chuck turned around. He said that the monk wanted to see him. The guy repeated with surprise that he wanted to see him. Chuck followed him through the dark place and thought about the monk, arguing that it must be Master William. The guide stopped and nodded. The hero thought about why he wanted to meet him. Chuck leaned over in response and arguing that he knew little about him and that in his past life he was not particularly prominent. He raised his head and remembered that he had a nickname, Eccentric Buddha. William sat in the darkness and raised his head and said that he understood. He laughed and asked about Chuck being the favorite of the Almighty God of Chaos. The hero stood in front of him and did not understand what he was talking about, asking again about the Almighty God of Chaos. The old man answered that it was an immortal being beyond human understanding. Chuck looked at him in surprise and cried out questioningly that he would be kind enough to tell him more. William answered that it was impossible. The monk smiled and continued that if he told him and survived, he would get rid of the flesh and become God in heaven. Chuck, frowning, remembered Chloe, whose face was covered in blood. The hero fell to his knees and asked what in that case, where he could get answers. Something flashed and in an instant changed all the colors around. Chuck looked at it in surprise, wondering what it was. He watched as the monk's eyes glowed in the darkness. The guy opened his eyes wider, hearing that they had to go north. William opened his eyes wide, which glowed with magic, and continued to say that in 5 years, in a place eternally covered with snow, he would meet someone very important. Chuck sat down and, crossing his legs, listened attentively to the old man. He asked what just happened. The monk replied that his question was meaningless. He opened his mouth wide and continued that the spirit was speaking in him, and he did not even remember the words he had spoken. Chuck leaned forward and asked if he served Buddha and that was why he was possessed. The monk laughed loudly and replied that that was probably why he was called the eccentric Buddha. The guy continued to listen attentively. William said that he did not know why the spirit suddenly spoke to him through him. Maybe this was the answer to his question. The heroes sat opposite each other, and the old man asked what he had heard about him being here to return the secret manual. The guy replied that yes, that was it, and pushed the notebook towards him. The monk asked what he might want in return for the thing he had picked up by chance. Chuck laughed in response. The old man threw something into the hero's hands and said that he still had to reward him, that it was a large circulation pill and that he had to eat it. The guy caught it and agreed approvingly. He looked at the burning capsule in surprise and cried out questioningly about this pill. What a valuable thing for a simple guide. The old man watched him calmly and noted that he was making a fuss about the reward in vain, and added that this was how Chloe described him. The hero was taken aback by what he heard. He asked again who he had just mentioned. William noted that he was asking again, although he had heard everything perfectly well. The hero leaned forward and asked that Chloe was here. The old man put his hands on his knees and said that he was interested. Chuck exclaimed about the request that if he knew, then please let him tell. William smiled and said that since he wanted to know so much. The guy opened his eyes wide, and behind him stood Tom. He stood with a satisfied, anticipatory face. The old man shouted for the hero to fight this guy. This is the future of Shaolin Tom. Chuck fell at the feet of his opponent. He spread his arms out to the sides and thought about how he had lost. Chloe and Scarlet appeared in his thoughts, telling him that he had trained for years but was still losing. He continued to think that he felt so pathetic that he could not argue with his own thoughts. He remembered how Nigel had knocked the spear out of his hands and reasoned that he had lost the fight with him, but at least he had done something. Tom stood and looked humbly ahead. The hero continued to think about how Tom seemed to have taken candy from a child, and why he had not heard anything about him in his past life. Who the hell is he? The old man raised his hand and asked Tom what he thought. He slowly replied that, frankly speaking, he lacked a lot. Chuck was lying on the ground, writhing in pain. Tom calmly and with a serious face reasoned that, first of all, experience. Although his spear technique was quite advanced, he was not able to realize its full potential. The hero stood up weakly, sat down, and continued to listen that he was bad at controlling his internal energy, and that his large amounts of energy were not yet under his control. The old man grabbed the hero by the head and noted that the overall energy inside him was not balanced. Chuck asked again about the overall energy. The monk continued that such things were very rare and that he would take a look now. Tom, raising an eyebrow, watched as the two did something. Chuck wondered what he was doing, and the old man told him to just stand still, calling him an idiot. William tied a staff to his leg and told him to walk. The guy, confused, put his foot down and asked how he should walk. The old man grinned and said that it was difficult to move like that, and noted that this was the current state of his body, just as ridiculous. Chuck moved with difficulty with a stick tied to his leg. Monk William talked about the first thing being the mind. He understands his martial art well, the second thing being energy. But the volume of internal energy quickly increased, the third thing being the body. And his body was not ready for it. No understanding, the main vessels were clogged. He pointed out that the lead was the body, the tied leg was the mind, the staff was energy. The old man added that despite the high level of understanding and energy, the energy was stagnating in his body. The guy looked at him sternly and thought that his internal energy had increased because of the pills, and his understanding because he had learned the improved sword energy while fighting Amanda. Tom dodged Chuck as he fell. The old man talked about how if both his legs were the same length, he would be able to walk without any problems. But when they were different lengths, the hero raised his head after falling and asked what he should do. The old man put his hands behind his back and said that he should clean the main vessels first because if he did that the energy flow would be smooth and his control problems would disappear. Chuck got angry and shouted that he had to improve his body. In response, he heard that cleaning the main vessels was the easiest method. Tom stood still, watching this. The old man turned to him and said that he wanted him to help this kid with martial arts for now, which he accepted approvingly. The toy was torn and fluff flew in all directions. William said that otherwise in 10 years the energy would get completely out of control and that as a follower of Buddhism, he could not allow this to happen. Chuck listened sadly and thought about being out of control. The old man turned and said that the kid he liked asked me to guide you if you came and he meant Chloe. The guy opened his eyes wide, looking. Tom and Chuck walked in step. Tom called out to him and asked him what he had been thinking about since their fight. They were walking along the street past lamp posts. The hero replied that he had become a little stronger. He calmly continued to tell him that he had reached the level of the Supreme Master after years of wandering and had recently been enlightened, and now he could use improved energy. The temple was beautiful in the rays of the sun, with mountains visible in the background. The hero continued that he had lost to both him and Nigel, which meant that he still had a long road ahead. Tom turned to him and asked if he was thinking too much and that at his age, people rarely reach such a level. He looked at him calmly and added that he was simply unlucky with his opponents, and that Nigel was not the only genius. He clarified that he was called the future of Shaolin, although he was still not strong enough and that he had been trained by the monks since early childhood and that he had eaten dozens of pills. Chuck looked at him and thought that they had started from different places. The sun's rays fell on the roofs of the temple and Tom added that he still couldn't defeat the lesser heavenly demon. The guy glanced at him questioningly and exclaimed if he had fought her. Tom looked away and answered that yes, when she was here. The girl was heading towards the temple, where the monks were meeting her. The guy wondered why Chloe came to Shaolin and why she was here. Tom said that she really wanted to see Shaolin, and it sounded very impudent from a 17-year-old. The monks looked at her, and no one could reproach her for it. The girl smiled. He continued to tell, remembering that this is how she was born, and it remained to be accepted as a given. Tom lay and looked at the leaving girl. He said that he was shocked by their fight. He lay defeated on the ground and trembled all over, remembering that he was completely defeated and this loss was even worse than yours. Chuck looked him in the eye and asked how strong Chloe had become. Tom replied that he was not at the level to judge. Tom opened his eyes wide and listened in surprise, saying that it was obvious that she had long since surpassed the level of the highest master. The hero turned forward, smirking. The monk asked what connected them together. Chuck covered his mouth with his hand and said that he was her friend. Trees with golden leaves stood inside the temple. Chloe's face towered over him. Chuck put his hand on his chest and declared that she was his target. Tom looked at him in amazement. He closed his eyes, lowered his head and replied that he understood, and it was no wonder that he was so nervous then. The monk pulled out a weapon and added that what you lacked most was experience, but this can be compensated for. He waved his spear and said that although he would face many defeats and despair in the process, he hoped that he was ready. Chuck pointed his spear towards his opponent, and cried out that he had already become accustomed to despair, but only to the feeling itself. The heroes prepared for the fight, and the guy thought that it was still not easy to get up again and again. He looked with a crazy look and thought that it seemed to him that he had started to catch up with her, but she was still very far away. He looked at the energy surge, and continued that while he was crawling to his better self, Chloe had already flown far ahead. Tom threw the spear on his shoulder and watched the defeated Chuck without emotion. The hero, with his arms spread out to the sides, lay and continued to think that this was why he. The guy began to switch off, and asked again. View of the room in the temple. Chuck with a face in bumps said that he was going to stay in Shaolin for a while. Nigel and Scarlett looked at him in surprise from the floor after his statement. Looking at the corner with flowers on the wall, someone apologized asking who he was. Nigel was taken aback and asked if Chuck had sparred with Tom, to which he received the answer that he had and that he was really strong. Nigel smirked and said that when he asked his master about it, he did not even raise an eyebrow. The guy introduced the warrior and said that Tom was strong, but he had never heard of him. Sighing, he added that the 4 great clans had some reputation in area, but they were still weaker than the 10 great sects. An image of warriors appeared in his mind while Nigel said that there were 3 rising stars of the Orthodox sects, from the Supplicant sect, from the Wudong sect, and Tom from Shaolin. The protagonist listened attentively to the fact that martial artists focus the most on their training. They are the secret weapon of the sect, and will never leave it, which is why he hears about them for the first time. Closing his eyes, Nigel asked if it means that he is staying in Shaolin, noting that it is a pity, because he wanted to bring him to his clan. Standing opposite, Chuck replied that he will definitely find him later. The protagonist was taken aback when Scarlett said that it was time for her to say goodbye. Smiling, the girl said that she planned to travel without following any specific route. She, with a satisfied look, emphasized that although she does not study martial arts, she has no benefit from sitting around there, so she is leaving too. Scarlett pushed Chuck down and began to tickle him, asking if he was sad and did not want to part with his cool girlfriend. The protagonist began to tremble. Scarlett hovered over him and said that Chuck was a real punching bag, going through grueling training over and over again and still coming back beaten wherever he went. Looking into his eyes, the girl asked where he would meet his end when she was not around, to which she received the answer that if the protagonist tried hard enough, this would not happen. Shifting her gaze, the girl said that she understood him. She put the bracelet on his hand, saying that it was connected to her soul. Sitting on Chuck's legs, Scarlett said that if he wanted to see him, he would give a signal, wherever he was. Smiling, the girl asked him to promise that the protagonist would train hard and someday save her and not be a punching bag. The protagonist, with a satisfied look, agreed with her. Disappointed, Nigel thought that he was jealous. The next day, a scream was heard in the settlement. Scarlett waved and screamed that they would see each other next time. Chuck saw them off. The dumbfounded protagonist presented Harvey's corpse. The girl turned around at the protagonist's loud cry. Chuck stood still and asked why she treated him so well. Taken aback, Scarlett whispered that now the protagonist was making a fuss over her sweet behavior. A dark aura enveloped the protagonist. She looked at him with a serious expression. Holding the back of her head, the girl said that they had already discussed this, but since he was so worried, she would tell him. Puzzled, Chuck listened, thinking about it now. It actually seemed like the truth, that for some unknown reason she was drawn to him from the very first meeting. Upset, Scarlett said that it was strange. Usually she did not try to get close to people. The protagonist, surrounded by a purple aura, listened attentively, that he was like a magnet. It was quite strange. The girl looked at the sky. Putting her hand on her hip, Scarlett said that having traveled with him, she can say without a doubt that he is a nice guy. The protagonist was taken aback by the words that he is sometimes boring and indifferent to everything, but she wants to support him, seeing his hard work. Smiling, the girl added that he is ideal for beating, and also loyal, not at all like those who stick a knife in the back. Besides, he is handsome. Chuck opened his mouth in surprise. A smile appeared on his face. The protagonist bowed his head in laughter and clarified what it was for, after which Scarlett asked to live a couple of years with a wrinkled grandfather in a tower, then he will definitely be able to understand her feelings. The girl noted with a satisfied look that he should live with his head held high, and not act like a fool. He deserved more if he did not want to die from beatings. Encouraged, Chuck agreed with her. The protagonist watched his comrades go. He clenched his hand into a fist. The protagonist began to examine his hand. He held a spear in front of him. Examining the weapon, Chuck thought that he had refused to use the spear and demonic armor in Shaolin. They reminded him of the past, looking for easy ways to achieve something. Leaving there, the protagonist said that along with them, he would leave his weak self there. Walking through the cave, the protagonist added that he would put aside the large circulation pill from the master. It would further shake the balance in his body. Chuck imagined the old man who said that in 5 years, in a place eternally covered with snow, he would meet someone very important. The protagonist imagined familiar girls and came to the conclusion that the meeting with Chloe will take place in 6, and in 5 the dungeon will open, in which she will meet Brittany. Taking out a wooden spear, Chuck noted that it is clear that the important person in the prophecy is Brittany. He only has 5 years left. He asked himself with a serious face how far he can go. The protagonist stood opposite Tom. Smiling, the guy asked why Chuck left his spear and demonic armor. Standing opposite, the protagonist answered that they do not suit him now. Stretching out his hand, Tom said that by studying martial arts, he learns to use his body, but the main thing in the body is the heart. Swinging the spear, Tom said that the heart affects the whole body. It is the key to energy. Such are the martial arts of Shaolin. Smiling, he asked to observe the essence of Shaolin for himself and experience it on his own skin. Chuck smirked, emphasizing the fact that he could still hear the cicadas. He charged into battle with the thought firmly lodged in his head. The sounds of battle could be heard in the cave. Tom jumped back and said that Chuck had impressive basic techniques. He had honed them well. Swinging his spear over his head, he added that the spear technique he had learned, despite its advancement, looked awkward for some reason. The protagonist breathed loudly and replied that it was because he had run away. After parrying the attack, the protagonist reported that no matter how much he trained, he could not advance further. He ran away from difficulties, repeating simpler techniques over and over: parry, block, and strike. Tom frowned and said that if someone could become an advanced master with the 3 basic techniques, there would be no point in learning advanced martial arts, and the technique he avoided would have most masters rip their throats out for it. A pink aura enveloped Chuck's spear. Streams of energy began to move towards Tom. The boy closely watched the mana. The magical snake was under his feet. A powerful blow hit him. Clouds of dust rose around Chuck. He said with a serious expression that this was why he did not want to run away anymore. Tom's spear was broken in half. He examined it. Smiling, he said that the path of martial arts has no end. They must accept their shortcomings and correct them. Many beads of sweat ran down Chuck's face while he listened to him say that he was not a genius. Geniuses had flown far ahead while he crawled. Tom folded his arms and explained that it was okay to feel despair, but he shouldn't let it consume him. If he couldn't fly, then he could walk. If he couldn't walk, then he had to crawl. And if he couldn't crawl, then he should try crawling again. Frowning, the protagonist asked if Tom himself was flying. The guy remembered meeting Chloe and said that he used to think so, but that delusion went away when he met the lesser sky demon. Tom, looking satisfied, said that he hadn't flown, but if he worked hard he could. Looking around the cave, Chuck wondered what about him. The protagonist imagined an insect and wondered what the earth beetle could hope for, if only to scurry around in the cold earth. He began to walk through the cave and noted that for now he could only twitch, but one day he would definitely fly. Chloe kicked the protagonist, and the plot told us that Chloe and Brittany had no talent for teaching. Geniuses don't know what it's like not to be gifted. Brittany held a sign in her hands, with which she asked why the protagonist couldn't. Tom stood next to Chuck as we were told that he was a better teacher, having been trained by many monks since he was a child. Tom's fist and blade were shrouded in mana, as the story told us that he had learned 72 advanced Shaolin styles and fought using as many different equipment and martial arts. The protagonist rushed into battle and noted that they had now switched to sharpened weapons. Tom slapped him and said that his senses were confused. Only the 6th one was sharpened, and the other 5 were stuck in one place. He held his hand in front of the spear blade and said that his energy circulation was SOSO, he needed to improve it. The exhausted protagonist listened as his understanding was terrible, he needed to work harder than the others. Holding the spear in his hand, the protagonist thought that he felt the full depth of his pity and uselessness that day, but he did not run away. He lunged and added that he had been practicing the advanced technique of the 9th heaven spear. As usual, his progress had stagnated. He concentrated the energy in his hands and thought that he had been training the circulation of energy. It was not going very well. Closing his eyes, Chuck emphasized the fact that he had been developing his 5 senses, finally finding balance in them. The protagonist imagined himself standing in the middle of a white space and noted that he lacked understanding. He intensified his training as soon as he felt it. The seasons changed one another. The night sky enveloped the settlement. Looking at Tom, Chuck told us that he had never defeated him. The experience of all the monks was concentrated in him. He was the true embodiment of Shaolin. The protagonist rushed into battle, with the thought that he would follow Shaolin and experience it on his own skin. The protagonist's face was furious. Standing on the ledge, Chuck came to the conclusion that he was just a grain of sand in this huge world. His face was calm. He sat in the lotus position and began to reason that the larva curled up in the ground thinks that the world is limited to its shelter. It does not want to become like that. Inspecting the settlement, the protagonist said that he wants to fly over the world and see it all. William came up to him from behind and asked if the frog was going to get out of the well. Turning around, Chuck called out to him. He smiled at the words that he had changed and asked if this was true. The old man, with a satisfied look, said that he could live in the well with his martial arts, after which he asked what he wanted. The protagonist saw William laugh at the words that he wanted to see the world, after which the master replied that anyone could do it. The protagonist, with a serious look, said that he wanted to fly over the world and see it all. William, with a satisfied look, said that this was not a bad ambition, but he was too small for this. Sitting in front of the master, Chuck added that he did not want to leave this as a dream. Looking at him, the old man asked what he had learned over the past 6 months. The protagonist, smiling, closed his eyes and replied that he had learned to crawl. William stood in front of him and noted that this was good. Walking away, he said that it was time to learn to walk. Chuck looked after him. He suddenly turned his gaze. A bright light emanated from behind the mountain. Holding his hands behind his back, the protagonist reasoned that time passed. More than a year and a half had passed since his arrival in Shaolin. He was already 20, he once asked Tom. Looking at the guy, Chuck asked if it was difficult to help him. Standing opposite, the protagonist added that he was too weak, after which he told us that although he had become stronger, he could not completely get rid of his inferiority complex. Chuck calmly said that he doubted that there was any benefit in sparring with him, and then asked if it wasn't a waste of time to spend on him. Tom smiled and said that he didn't know why the protagonist thought so, but there were benefits for him too. He imagined himself fighting Chuck and said that in their fights he was repeating his martial arts, This was a process he had to go through to get the Shaolin martial arts into his mind. They required deep attention. Standing opposite, Tom said that there was no end to his martial arts training. He wanted to rise higher. He smiled and asked if Chuck dreamed of the same thing. The protagonist, with a serious face, thought that after his words, he understood why he asked this question. He imagined himself in his past life and emphasized the fact that he still couldn't get rid of the past that bound him. And he doubted the sincerity of people, although they did not even give him a reason to do so. Chuck clenched his hand into a fist. He saw his comrades in front of him and thought that after all these strange situations, he was afraid to get into them again. After returning to the past, their kindness became a support for him. The protagonist stood in a dark space. He held his face with his hand. Walking through the cave, Chuck noted that his current dream is not to hone his martial arts to perfection, and not even to gain Chloe's recognition, but to stop running away. The protagonist came to William. He asked with a serious look what the old man knew about his blessing. Smiling, William clarified whether Chuck had finally plucked up the courage to ask about it. The protagonist imagined his first meeting with the master and noted that he asked him about the creature that helps him, then he remained silent. The puzzled protagonist wondered what if he asked not about the creature, but about the effects of the blessing. Examining the walls of the cave, Chuck said that a year and a half ago he got to Shaolin. Smiling, William asked why he asked this question only now, because he could have asked it earlier. Standing in front of the old man, the protagonist said that he was afraid of himself. Looking down, the protagonist said that he no longer wanted to run away. The master said with a satisfied look that he had a beautiful expression on his face. Dumbfounded, Chuck listened to the words that, as he had already guessed, the effect he received caused compassion for him. The protagonist began to tremble with fear. Lowering his head, the protagonist said that everything was clear to him. Chuck shuddered at the words that this blessing only changed his perception. William said with a satisfied look that it was only useful at first impression. William imagined how Chuck scared away all his comrades and told that no blessing would help if he had a hard time getting along with people. If he received something from them, then the reason lies in his character and actions. Dumbfounded, the protagonist cried out, "What does this mean?" William said with a smile on his face that all the relationships built so far are not fake. Tears came to Chuck's eyes. The protagonist was kneeling in front of the master, who said that he could relieve him of part of the blessing, and the first impression would depend only on him, so he could build pure relationships without a drop of guilt. The protagonist wiped the tears from his eyes. His face was serious when he asked William to do this. Nigel, with a satisfied look, asked Chuck to look at his clothes and asked if he had taken the veil. The protagonist pointed to his head and said that his hair was still in place. Pouring alcohol into a glass, Nigel offered him a drink, adding that a lot of time had passed. The guy threw the glass at the protagonist. A pink aura enveloped the protagonist's hand. He pulled the glass towards himself, and replied that it was too rude for a prank. Looking at his comrade, Nigel said that he had become much stronger. Looking at the guy, Chuck congratulated him on reaching the highest level. The protagonist was surprised by the words that Nigel's beloved married another man. He imagined Nigel watching them from behind the wall. Having knocked glasses together, Nigel said that she did not like his arrogance and capriciousness, after which Chuck clarified what she was wrong about. Nigel emptied the glass to the bottom and said that in order to forget her, he trained like hell. This is just a pathetic level that he reached while trying not to think about failed love. He said with a smile that he was not happy with this and clarified that at Chuck's. The protagonist poured him alcohol while he asked if he liked training there. Smiling, the protagonist replied that he liked everything. Nigel with a satisfied look noted that Chuck had changed a lot. The anxious feeling he felt at their first meeting had disappeared. Holding the glass in front of his face, the protagonist asked if it was true. Chuck was taken aback by the words that it was definitely there when they first met, and every time he saw it, it appeared in his heart again. Nigel added with a smile on his face that he no longer felt it, and that he even thought that he had started to like guys. The protagonist was happy to hear this. Looking at the sky, the protagonist said that it was great, after which the plot told us that another year had passed. Chuck turned 22 and left Shaolin. Holding the scroll in his hand, William asked to deliver this letter to the leader of the Manhwa sect in Dreimer. The protagonist introduced Mercer and noted that it turned out great. The Temple of the God of Time, Dinner, where Mercer sent him, is also in Dreimer. Examining the scroll, he wondered if this was the power of prophecy. Looking at the ground, Chuck called Neville. The boy appeared in front of him and asked what he owed him. The protagonist stated with a satisfied look that he wanted to buy some information. The protagonist introduced his friends and said that he wanted to know about the Phantom Sword, John and the Lightning, Brittany. Looking around the forest, Chuck added that there was more. Looking at Neville, the protagonist noted that he also wanted information about the lesser heavenly demon, Chloe. Neville imagined the girl fighting and said that Brittany nobly helps the helpless. Her face was calm while the boy said that she became quite famous from this. A week ago she stopped in a large city named Rubes. Neville imagined John holding a katana in his hand and stated that he was making a name for himself through difficult trials. His eyes glowed brightly while the boy said that John went on a journey to find reputable sects and martial artists to fight them, currently on his way to the sect of Mount Hua, Dreamer. Looking at the crystal ball, the protagonist asked about the Mount Hua sect in his mind. He thoughtfully suggested that they might meet. Neville started talking about Chloe with a serious expression. Chuck shifted his gaze with a smile on his face. The guy imagined the girl sitting on the throne. In Neville's imagination, he imagined Chloe's face and told her that she had gathered many followers around her thanks to her charisma and strength. There were many people standing around Chloe, while the guy said that there were about 20 of them, but all of them were at least top-level masters, which is why many began to fear them. Neville introduced Bill and suggested that the same fate awaited the bloody heavenly demon. He owned the northernmost territories. Bill looked at Chloe, while the guy said that a group of lesser heavenly demons was heading towards them. They would soon clash. Neville stood still and said that the bloody sky demon would most likely win, since he had been ruling this territory for a long time, to which Chuck replied that he was wrong. Taken aback, the guy asked again. The protagonist with a smile on his face said that he was sure that the lesser sky demon would win. The protagonist was sitting on a stump. Looking at Chloe through the crystal ball, he reasoned that the last time he saw her was 8 years ago. He embarrassedly emphasized that Chloe had become much prettier. Taken aback, Chuck wondered what he was thinking about right now. Looking up, the protagonist began to reflect that the bloody sky demon and the lesser sky demon had never met each other. It was strange. An image of Chloe appeared in his imagination, and Chuck added that she pretended to be a guy in his past life. But now she openly walks around as a woman. Looking at the ball, the protagonist mentally wondered if her values had changed compared to his past life. The confused protagonist thought about the encounter with the bloody sky demon. Getting up from the stump, Chuck emphasized that he wanted to rush north to help her, but there were 2 years left until their meeting. The protagonist looked at the sky. He remembered how Chloe asked him to make her his target as a child. Chuck calmly noted that since that promise, she had always been hers. Walking through the forest, the protagonist came to the conclusion that therefore he should only do what she needed now. She would take care of the bloody sky demon herself, and then she would wait for him at the top. He needed to keep his promises to become stronger. Chuck's face was satisfied. The protagonist suddenly stopped. He looked at the sky again and thought that he had a feeling that he had already broken one of them. Chloe looked at her hands upset. She thought with a depressed look that she still hadn't grown big breasts. The man stood behind her and asked if she was awake yet. He added with a serious look that it would be better if she slept a little more. Turning around, Chloe clarified if she had told her not to call her that, noting that she never took them as subordinates. They could follow her, but they shouldn't expect anything like that. Taken aback, the man agreed with her. The warriors stood in front of her. Chloe imagined many hungry eyes looking at her. Looking at her followers, the girl reasoned that she didn't like those burning eyes. Since she became the young head of the demonic cult, they followed her everywhere. Sighing, Chloe wondered if she should kill them all, adding that she missed Chuck. She looked up at the guy who asked if she was a lesser sky demon. Bill happily assumed that she was full of energy, and then asked if she wanted to fight him. Standing in front of her, Chloe said that as a heavenly demon, she was curious about how skilled another heavenly demon was. Holding her chin, the girl asked him to just consider him unlucky, only he was within her reach. Bill smirked and replied that she was overconfident. She would hardly continue to say such things after their fight. Looking at Bill, Chloe asked which hand he was holding the spoon with. The girl, shrouded in a red aura, said that she would leave that hand intact. The plot moves us to the Mount Hua sect, where a voice came from the city, saying that this was the entrance to the sect. Extending his hand, the man asked where he came from and asked for the purpose of his visit. The protagonist picked up the scroll and replied that he was here on behalf of Master William, thinking that he had not spent much time on the way to Drymer. The guard bowed and said that he was asking for forgiveness, and would immediately take him to the leader of the sect. The protagonist calmly thought about how, once he was done here, he should look in on the god of time, Dinner. Having stuck his sword into the ground, the old man asked if he was the guy from Mount Mercer. Smiling, John said that they had not seen each other for a long time. He got up from the ground and said that he seemed to have forgotten everything that happened on the mountain. Chuck looked happily, hearing that this was the hardest moment in his life. He would probably remember it until his death. Remembering the walking man, the protagonist asked how he recognized him so quickly. He had a ban on vision. John looked up and replied that he recognized him by the internal energy that emanated from him. He was an ordinary child back then, but he had really grown up since then. He was sitting in front of the guy. The old man extended his hand and asked if he had any business here, adding that he should not waste time on him and go finish it. The protagonist looked at him in confusion. The guys behind frowned, hearing that it was not worth wasting time on him. John was sitting on a rock. He looked down. The old man held the sword with shaking hands. John remembered watching the guy running. He imagined the girl hugging him from behind. Meanwhile, the protagonist looked around the room and said that it was nice to meet you. Derek smiled and said that he was the leader of the Hua Mountain sect. The protagonist nodded and replied that he was here on behalf of Master William. Reaching out for the scroll, the man said that the current leader of the Murima Alliance had resigned and he had asked the master to become the new leader. He looked at the letter of refusal. Throwing the scroll back, Derek said that he knew it would be like this stupid old man. The boy looked tense, hearing that he had heard from the students who saw him off that he was familiar with the ghost sword, and replied that they had crossed paths by chance in the past. The man frowned, listening to what he had been waiting near the entrance. Derek sat in front of the interlocutor, telling him that the ghost sword wanted to fight him, but he did not want it. Lowering his eyebrows, Chuck asked if he could find out the reason. The protagonist walked on the ground, recalling the words that as a martial artist, the leader liked to fight with skilled opponents, and would accept a challenge from someone who was strong and experienced enough. The protagonist stopped in front of the old man. Looking at his stern face, he thought that the ghost sword was dangerous. The boy stood calmly in front of the man. Frowning, Chuck asked if it was true that he used dark sorcery. John smiled and asked if Derek said so, that was why he refused to fight him. The protagonist looked at the dark ground, asking what kind of dark sorcery he learned, adding that he thought he only focused on the sword technique. The protagonist looked away, hearing the old man ask if he had ever reached his limits, and answered in the affirmative. Smiling, John said that it was not so, he was too young to talk about them, and asked if he felt the approach of old age. He raised his hand, telling that even a user of internal energy will eventually notice how the strength leaks from his fingers. No matter what he does, he will not be able to return to the peak of his strength. Lowering his head, the old man asked if he was familiar with such despair. John looked at him with wild eyes, saying that even if he took up dark sorcery and cast aside his martial arts pride, he wondered if he knew this desperation, wanting to achieve more, no matter what it took. The boy stood in front of him silently. The old man said with a serious expression that he was on his way. Chuck looked worried, listening to him say that he no longer wanted to show him this side of him. The protagonist looked down sadly. The protagonist walked through the grass, thinking that he left because he felt that he was not the one to say anything and decided to focus on other tasks rather than think about it. Approaching the house, he thought about the fact that he had started searching for the temple of the deity that Mershur had mentioned. Could this hut really be the temple? Wiping his mouth, Dinur said that he was lost. A light was coming from the guy's chest. Clutching his head, the god asked if this was a sign, if Mershur had sent it. Seriously, why was it so problematic? He frowned and asked if he had traveled through time to come here. Spreading his arms out to the sides, Chuck replied that as expected, the gods could see it right away. Dinur sat in the air and said that he was the god of time. Frowning, the protagonist listened to him say that this was why he was not happy with any time cheaters like him. They were disrupting the natural flow of the world. The protagonist spread his arms wide and asked what exactly he meant, and the god asked if his life was really the same now as it had been before. Dinur imagined the guy in the past and now, and asked if all his actions were exactly the same, if he ate the same food, slept at the same time, dated the same people. Frowning, Chuck wondered if he was repeating all of this, and the god reported that even minor changes accumulate and affect the flow of the world. Imagining the girl turned away, the protagonist thought about Chloe no longer pretending to be a man and coming into conflict with a bloody sky demon. Dinur raised a finger and said exactly that, his very existence was already distorting the world. He remembered how blood dripped from the blade. Imagining John standing in front of the wounded man, the god said that changing this flow only produces new changes. The bloody Derek screamed. The old man breathed steam furiously. Looking at the hut, the protagonist asked if his very existence was already distorting the world. Frowning, he said that he regressed against his will. When he woke up, something had already clung to him. Dinur put his hand on his hip, hearing that he could say what it was, and answered negatively. Raising his hand in chains, the god said that even they, the gods, are not omnipotent, they are just beings who also cannot escape the shackles of death. Imagining a smoking silhouette of a man, he said that this is exactly what they should not talk about, otherwise let him be ready for destruction. The guy looked at it in fear. Smiling, Dinur suggested that he look at it. Looking at the hovering dark mana, the god said that the apostle was already here, and he only hinted a little, specifying whether he felt it. Chuck grinned in panic, wondering if this was the same feeling as from Mayor Shah or Mike. The god extended his hand and said that he was asking for forgiveness and wanted him to leave, and would not speak of it again. Dark mana hung in the air. The energy was gradually fading. The protagonist looked down and asked what it was. The protagonist raised his head, hearing that no god could answer his question, and no mortal could. Extending his hands, he asked if there was really no way to find an answer. Dinur looked at him seriously, and said that they needed to find Enverus. He stood in front of the guy and told him that he was the only one who had escaped the shackles of death, that his cause and effect was also distorted, but not like his, and that he should find it himself. Chuck listened, taken aback, as if he had heard everything and needed to leave, and asked him to wait a minute. The protagonist put his hand to his chest and said that he wanted him to give him a test. Dinur looked at him seriously. Looking at the serious protagonist, he asked why he was here, thinking that he had passed Mersh's test. The boy smiled and said yes, and the god said he refused. Dinur's eye glowed and he said that he seemed to be mistaken in some things. His test was far from the training that Mersh arranged on his mountain. The god hovered in front of the boy, saying that he was sorry, but he could not give it to him. Those who accepted his test were stronger than him. Leaning towards his face, Dinur said that they all went crazy and died in the end. Chuck walked away from the hut, thinking that he was kicked out. The protagonist remembered how the god extended his hand and said that he should go away and first clear his head before returning. If the thirst for self-destruction did not fade, let him come back, he would give him a test. The protagonist stepped on the ground, thinking that he decided to spend the night in the village and rest. As he advised, there was something ominous in the air. Imagining the old man holding out the sword to Derek, he thought that he soon learned that he had ambushed and killed the leader at night. The guy remembered John surrounded by mana, thinking that he had strained his memory with all his might, but he did not remember anything like this in the past. Imagining the old man sitting in the rocks, Chuck thought that the duel between the ghost sword and the Taoist Derek never happened. The ghost sword gave up and left the Manhwa sect. A year later, in the dungeon, he fought Chloe and died. The protagonist walked through the forest, thinking that this was the original event, was the reason for the changes in his regression. He continued walking and, without noticing it, he found himself at the entrance of the Manhwa sect. The man extended his hand, saying that he must stop and cannot go further. He stood with a crowd of guys, reporting that the inevitability network was activated here. Frowning, the stranger said that John had killed their leader with evil sorcery, had shown up in the middle of the night after being refused a duel. The protagonist looked at him seriously, asking if it was true that they couldn't give way. The guard stood behind him and said that he was with a ghost sword. Yesterday this guy had exchanged a few words with him while he was waiting outside. The man grabbed the hilt of the sword. The stranger was taking out the weapon. Frowning, Chuck thought about the fact that because of his regression, the Taoist Derek had died, and the ghost sword was now being pursued. Should he take responsibility? Having struck the enemy with a spear, the protagonist thought that he didn't know what he felt. The protagonist squatted down and ordered to get lost, thinking that in any case, he needed to meet the ghost sword immediately. He looked up in surprise when he heard his name being called. The guy stood to the side and said that he didn't think he would meet him here. What a strange coincidence. Mike smiled and said that it must be fate. The man turned around and asked if he knew him. The stranger pointed his finger at the protagonist and said that they had cordoned off this area, and then he showed up, saying that he wanted to go through. The guy looked thoughtfully, hearing that he had definitely come to the aid of the ghost sword. Frowning, Chuck listened as he asked if he was going to help John, and answered that he didn't know. Mike put his hand to his chin. He happily raised his finger and said that he would go with him then. The man was taken aback, hearing that he wouldn't go there without him. Hugging the protagonist, the guy said that everything was fine. If he tried to help the ghost sword, he would kill it. He looked at him with a smile and said that it was nothing. The protagonist followed him, asking what happened to John and why he was here. Mike smiled and said he thought he would understand when he saw it. The guy stood in front of the injured man, saying that it was witchcraft. Chuck listened in shock as he heard that energy absorption was an ability that could take away the target's energy. Mike took the stranger's hand, telling him that when they said that it was witchcraft, he thought of the art of illusion. It lived up to its name, Demon's Sword. Leaning over, he said that John had crossed the line. It was not like the Demon's Sword and the Manhwa sect would settle everything between themselves. The protagonist pursed his lips as he heard that the hunt for him would most likely spread throughout area. Even if he managed to leave this place alive, his luck would not last long. A raven flew onto the guy's shoulder. Mike sat next to the man and said that it was his familiar who had returned from reconnaissance. The protagonist looked up at the night sky. Stunned, he listened to the bird find out where the demonic sword was. The guy clenched his trembling fist. Chuck frowned when he heard that the Taoist from the Hua sect would be late, and asked him again. Extending his hand with mana, Mike said that he had interrupted their conversation a little. He could go meet him alone. He stood in front of the interlocutor and said that if they sent the masters of the arts, they would fall victim to the absorption of energy and only make him stronger. Smiling, the guy said that he wanted to meet him, so he was giving him the opportunity. Mike looked at him with interest and said that he was very curious about what other changes the flow would undergo if they met him. The main character bowed his head. The protagonist held the hilt, listening. Was it really all over? He was kneeling in front of the enemy. Sweating, the guy shouted that he had not given up yet. Chuck quickly extended the spear, using the fifth form. The old man raised the sword. The protagonist looked at him in shock. The protagonist swung his weapon downwards. John hit him on the back of the head. He smiled and said that it looked like he was still having a hard time using this technique. The boy lay with a bump on his head, listening to him say that he understood why he was in a hurry, but he shouldn't push himself, because he was still young and naive. Chuck stood behind him. The old man looked at him seriously and called him. The protagonist stood calmly in the forest. Frowning, the protagonist said that he wanted to ask a question. Looking at John, who was turned away, he asked what he would have done if he hadn't met him at the entrance to the Manhwa sect. The boy remembered standing in front of his seated interlocutor, wondering what he would have done if he hadn't told him the reason why Taoist Derek had rejected his request for a duel. Chuck stood behind him. The protagonist frowned, hearing that he would have given up on the idea then. Looking at the starry sky, John said that he would have continued to think that he was not strong enough to fight the leader of one of the 10 great sects. But he voiced the real reason. Raising his hand, he said that it was not in his weakness, but in the fact that he used witchcraft. The protagonist lowered his head, listening to how he could not fight him fairly, so he snuck into the sect in the middle of the night. The old man turned around. John was smiling madly and said that he could finally enjoy the fight with the Taoist Derek. The guy looked at him in fear. Remembering how he extended his sword to the enemy, the old man said that then he realized how huge the world was. This was the strongest person he had ever fought. His mouth was bleeding and he said that it was a great fight. I'm sure he was happy with such a death. Chuck was taken aback. The protagonist remembered how the man held the sword. The protagonist closed his eyes in displeasure. Raising his spear, he said that because of him, the Taoist Derek died, and they declared a hunt for him. John frowned, replying that he was saying strange things. Maybe he decided to do this because of him, but he made all the choices himself. Biting his lip, the guy listened to how it was impossible to know everything about the world. Why should he take responsibility for it? Chuck stood calmly in front of him. Extending his spear, the protagonist said that for him, everything was wrong. Touching his chin, the old man said that he was too self-confident. It did not seem like he had even managed to become a supreme martial artist. Frowning, the protagonist replied that he knew he could not win. He watched as the opponent raised his sword, wondering if it was right for him to feel responsible for this. The lives of many people had already changed under his influence. The guy held the weapon, thinking that the only reason he pointed the spear at him was to achieve satisfaction. Remembering the wounded man lying there, Chuck thought that knowing that everything was because of him also meant that he was responsible for the corpses he left behind. Frowning, the protagonist thought that he couldn't bear this guilt any longer. The protagonist watched as his opponent held the sword and listened as Mike said that he was really going to fight with a demonic sword. Wasn't it too much of a burden? He looked forward seriously and communicated through telepathy that he needed to contact the Taoists of Manhwa sect. Looking at the moon, the guy heard that in that case, he should be careful. He had absorbed the energy of 10 people and was now several times stronger. Holding out the burning sword, John said that it was time to find out how much he had grown. Chuck lowered his eyebrows in alarm. The enemy raised his weapon with a grin and said that night was coming. Looking at the mad old man, the protagonist heard that he had turned into a vampire. The protagonist ran towards his rival, hearing through telepathy that it did not seem like the vampire who had turned the demonic sword was strong, and it was unlikely that such a person would be interested in him. Drawing out his spear, he used a lightning-fast splitting blow and heard that if you drink the blood of a higher vampire, you can defeat aging. The old man grinned, and Mike said that he did not notice it. John dealt many blows. He put his sword in front of him. Throwing the spear with mana forward, the guy listened that even if he was a mediocre vampire, it did not mean that he was weak. Chuck frowned, hearing that rather, the vampire's abilities were an additional bonus to his level of the highest master. Let him not lose his vigilance. Raising his weapon, the protagonist thought that he could not start with this. Looking at the dumbfounded opponent, the protagonist used the improved technique of the 9 Heavens Spear, the first form. John watched the flying stream of mana. He spun the sword in his hand. The old man grabbed the handle. The vampire swung the weapon. John dodged the attack. The guy stepped on the ground. Chuck ran away from the flying enemy. The protagonist grinned and held out the spear. The protagonist gripped the handle tightly. The old man quickly dodged the blow. The vampire attacked him with a sword in the stomach. The illusion of the guy began to dissipate. Running behind the enemy, Chuck said that this was a substitution of bodies. Reflecting the blow, John said that this is Brittany's mystical art. He has learned it well. The protagonist grinned and held out the weapon. The old man swung the sword. The protagonist jumped back from the powerful attack. He braked with his feet. Having launched the mana streams, the guy activated the improved technique of the 9 Heavens Spear, the third form. The opponent looked at him in surprise. He looked away. The vampire closed his eyes. The old man dodged the attack. The energy flow rushed down. Laughter rang out under the night sky. John smiled and said that he would never have thought that the spear would jump out of the ground. What a bizarre technique. Wiping the blood from his mouth, he said that if he had been too late to dodge, the spear would have pierced his head through and through. The scratch on his nose disappeared. Gritting his teeth, the protagonist thought about the